Okay, great. We finished that hurdle. Okay, great. So next up, looking at my notes here. So just a note on some Zoom etiquette. We all know most of this by now, but if you could just remember to mute when you're not talking, that'll help with feedback. And I'll help out with that too. And then to all our presenters today, you should be able to share. If you want to go ahead and email me your presentation as a backup, just in case, I'll put my contact info in the chat here in a second. If you're having technical issues, feel free to direct chat me, or also, let me just put in there now, that's my contact info, so you can call me or text me if you need any help. Okay, we'll have time after each of these presentations, we'll have a little time for questions. So feel free to just save your questions there for after that talk. And you can put them in the chat as you think of them, and we'll go back to them. And then as we go through those questions, if you would just use the raise hand function too, that'll help us make sure we're getting to everyone's questions. You can find that at the bottom in the little toolbar on the screen. There's a reactions button, and you can press raise hand there, or a heart, or a smiley face, whatever you feel like. But yeah, all these ways of showing our emotions. Okay, so yeah, another note that we do not have a break for lunch today, but because this is on Zoom, we just think maybe you can mute yourself, turn your video off, and take lunch whenever you want. So feel free to do that, because it is a long meeting. It's about 4 hours. So just take care of yourself during that. And yeah, I think at the very end, we're going to have small group discussions in breakout rooms, and we're going to be using a shared Google Doc to do that. So we hope that can be a fun chance to work more closely with a few people instead of just having a big group. So yeah, we hope you stick around for that as well. Great. Any questions from people on any technical questions, or we'll go through the agenda next, but any questions on what I just said? Okay, great. Oh yeah, and people are still doing it, but feel free to put your organization in the chat box there so we know what group everyone's involved with. So we'll start out here. Hannah and Casey are going to go through our agenda today. So go for it.
Casey, do you want to do the IMW stuff first?
Got to unmute myself, sure. So we just went through welcome and introductions, and then we will do, I'll present, after we're done here with the agenda, I'll present a quick update on Middle Fork IMW. And then I can do the morning stuff here, Hannah, I guess. And then Hannah will give an update on the John Day Basin Partnership. And then we will move on, and Matt Kaler will present on juvenile Chinook floodplain accessibility and dispersal from REDS. We'll take a 15-minute break. And then in the afternoon, Stephen Kelly from the Warm Springs will give us an update on water temperature trend analysis. And then I'll have another presentation on Middle Fork IMW on our restoration inventory.
Yep, and then after that, we'll go on with Gus and Nick from ELR. They're our monitoring coordinators, and so they'll do a discussion about all of the stuff they've been dealing with monitoring coordination. After that, we have the UAV monitoring progress update from Herb Winters at Gillum SUECD. And then another presentation from Stefan at the Warm Springs Tribe about the bull trout monitoring they've been doing in the North Fork and Middle Fork. And then after that, we'll do those breakout rooms that we talked about, and then a quick little report out about kind of the key presentations you got from those breakout rooms. And then after, just the wrap up and next steps with Tori.
Great, thank you. So first off, Casey, would you like to share the Middle Fork IMW updates? And I'm just going to assume all the presenters will share their own presentation unless you tell me otherwise, just let me know.
All right. See if I can get this to work. Share screen. All right, can you see the first slide? The says Middle Fork John Day IMW update.
No.
No. Ah. Okay. Let me try this again. Oh, because I actually have to hit the button that says share.
Nice. Okay. There it is.
There it is. Okay, let's start from here. All right. Can you see that now? Okay. And I can see a little bit of you guys, but I can't see the chat. So if you have a question, either just jump up and down and turn your camera on or put it in the chat, and maybe Tori or Hannah can let me know if there's something that comes up in the chat. So hi to everybody. I think I've met a lot of you, but for those of you I haven't, I'm Casey Bleasner. I work for ODFW out of our LeGrand Fish Research Office. I am serving as the Middle Fork IMW coordinator and have been for the past few years. I am also the data steward, data manager role, and have been in that role for a number of years for both ODFW and the Middle Fork John Day IMW. A quick presentation overview. I have just a quick overview of the IMW, a partner list, salmon and steelhead productivity update, a monitoring overview / inventory, an update on the macroinvertebrate subgroup, an update on the water temperature subgroup, a little discussion about our outreach efforts and upcoming reporting, and then just a quick funding update. I have 15 minutes. I'm going to try really hard to keep it in that. If I go over, I promise I'll make it up later with my restoration inventory update. So just because we have some new people in both groups, I thought I'd give a quick overview of what the Middle Fork John Day IMW is. An IMW is an intensively monitored watershed. They are a long-term research project designed to deepen our understanding of how fish populations respond to habitat restoration. There's a network of IMWs across the Pacific Northwest, including about 11 or 12. And our Middle Fork IMW encompasses the upper section of the Middle Fork John Day River. Excuse me. And it's a collaborative effort that was established in 2008. We hold monthly meetings. And if you are interested in joining a meeting, please just let me know and I'll add you to our meeting list. We completed a 10-year summary report in 2017, and we're looking ahead to having completed 15 years of intensive monitoring in 2023. Our focal species include ESA listed summer steelhead and Chinook salmon and bull trout. In past IMW updates with the John Day Basin Partnership, I've been asked for monitoring restoration contacts. So I put together just a quick list. My thought was that this whole sort of presentation could be used as a reference for anybody that was interested. I can hand it out. Our contact with OWEB is Ken Fetcho. ODFW, Melody Faden is our NRS2 fish biologist. Lindsay Sapella is in a job rotation as a John Day Fish Research program leader. I'm Casey Bleasner, and then we have Jim Rizicki and Ian Tatum. Ian Tatum is in a job rotation as the is our East Region Fish Research Director, and Jim is on special assignment in retirement. Javen Bailey with the North Fork John Day Watershed Council with macroinvertebrate and discharge and restoration work with the Warm Springs right now, Stephen Kelly and Nicole Lexon. Forest Service, we have Lindsay Davies, Ryan Unzula, Erica Porter, and Amy Unthank. BOR, Mark Krogan, and then OSU and CRITFIC, we have Matt Kaler. And this is kind of the core group of people that I see at our monthly meetings, giving us updates. So this is a pretty busy slide, but I wanted to highlight the fact that the monitoring in the Middle Fork is truly intensive. In putting together this inventory, I counted at least 38 separate monitoring activities that have occurred in the Middle Fork since 2006, and I'm pretty sure that it's not inclusive, that I'm missing some. These projects are at different scales, watershed region project, and that's not depicted right here, but it is part of the inventory that I have. I'll continue to update this inventory and can provide it for reference, and also including contact information or offices where the data is located or where it could be requested from. And highlighted in the kind of dark color, darker colors are the long-term monitoring projects that are continuing in 2022. And then funding for this core monitoring is provided by PSMFC through OWEB and additional funding through BPA, different agencies, grants, and PCSRF. I'll say that I'll talk a little bit next about some of the long-term fish productivity monitoring, fish in, fish out. Stephen Kelly will provide an update on the water temperature trend analysis. And I'll talk a little bit about the water temperature subgroups and the macroinvertebrate subgroups as well. Oops, I guess those did get highlighted. And Matt Kaler will talk about floodplain use, parentage analysis, fry emergence. So for evaluating the restoration activities, we use a few approaches, but our primary monitoring is a watershed scale fish in, fish out productivity measure. And so the objective here is to evaluate watershed level changes to salmon and steelhead productivity as smolts per spawner in the IMW area compared to reference populations. And our reference populations for summer steelhead is the South Fork John Day, and our reference population for spring Chinook is the Upper John Day. We have data that goes through 2019, so as far back as a little bit further back than 2006 for all of the populations. I just stopped at 2006, going through 2019. As you can see from these graphs, we don't see a significant trend since the inception of the IMW in changes in productivity for either steelhead or salmon. So we're also looking at another measure of productivity for Chinook through stock recruitment curves, and Jim is working on this project. So stock recruitment curve will give us a slightly different look at productivity. And these stock recruitment curves show relationships between spawning adults and the expected numbers of recruits measured as returning adults that a spawning population eventually produces each season. So it's a change in production of offspring measured as returning adults as a function of spawner density for each population. The data that I'll show next spans brood years 2000 through 2014. And like I said, this is Jim's special project, and he's been working on the analysis and future reporting of this. So in the upper left-hand corner is the Middle Fork John Day. And remember, this is Chinook salmon, spring Chinook. So Middle Fork John Day, Upper Main Stem John Day, and North Fork John Day. So these curves suggest a density dependence, and the density dependence is likely related to freshwater habitat conditions. So it follows that targeted restoration actions can still have a positive influence on John Day Chinook populations. Jim, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think you covered it well, Casey. Yeah, two things to note. There is potential for density dependence here as you go from left to right on the graph. And it asymptotes at a certain point as well for each population. And that's just suggesting that there is some cap to these populations as well. Some of that influence is likely from out of the freshwater habitat.
So in addition to looking at the John Day Chinook populations, Jim has also been looking at a comparison between John Day populations and Lower Snake River Chinook populations. And here I'm showing the Middle Fork John Day Chinook compared to the Upper Grand Ronde Chinook population. So notice the five-fold decrease in productivity for the Upper Grand Ronde population across similar Middle Fork John Day densities over here. This suggests that there are additional factors outside the freshwater habitat that are influencing recruitment of the Upper Grand Ronde Chinook spawner recruit or stock recruitment. And this holds for the other Lower Snake River Chinook populations. Jim is looking at some additional analysis to maybe help explain some of these differences that we're seeing. Jim, did you want to add anything here?
No, I think you covered it again.
Okay, great. So we'll jump from fish. I'll talk about the macroinvertebrate and subgroup update. So Javen Bailey established a macroinvertebrate subgroup to help with how we can utilize the 11 years of drift and benthic macroinvertebrate data that's been collected in the IMW area. She is planning to hire a contractor to help with this data analysis, and we'll put out a request for proposals in the late summer, early fall of 2022 for a phased contract to analyze the IMW macroinvertebrate data. And this phased approach will produce a final report that we will incorporate into our 15-year IMW summary report, as well as provide some additional recommendations for macroinvertebrate monitoring data moving forward. The next meeting is May 20th. You can contact me or Javen if you'd like to be added to this macroinvertebrate subgroup. Javen, did you have anything you wanted to add here?
Nope, that sounds good.
Okay, thank you. And thanks, Javen, for organizing this subgroup. Next up, we'll talk about water temperature. Water temperature has been identified as the limiting factor of most concern in the IMW. And such, we have many water temperature monitoring locations and records. We've been working on organizing and standardizing our water temperature data collection for a number of years and have really made some great progress in the last 2 years. And as part of that, Lindsay Spella and Melody and Javen have established a base network of watershed level water temperature monitoring locations, which is the map that you see. There's agreement between partners to keep these loggers in place for the long term. And the objective is to continue to provide data to measure watershed level trends and changes in water temperature. And Stefan will update that trend analysis later. These base network loggers locations are available on ArcGIS Online. We have a group there. We also have established logger deployment and data collection standard protocols. We're nearing completion on a memorandum of understanding for partners about water temperature data collection and providing the data for sharing. The contacts for this group, Melody is our subgroup coordinator, and Javen is our data steward. And so all of this water temperature data is stored with the North Fork John Day Watershed Council in the WSKI database. And Javen is our amazing data steward for that. A quick update on our website and upcoming reporting. We do have a website. It needs some updating. I have some news stories to put up there. I'm hoping to update with some new reports and things that have come out and will be coming out. We also have some ArcGIS online groups for water temperature monitoring and monitoring locations. We're also, Melody and I have been working on mobile data collection for steelhead spawning ground surveys, which would make some of that data more available online. In summer and fall, we'll have some summary reports from the OWEB PSMFC funded groups, including ODFW for work completed from 2017 through 2021. We're expecting some time in June or the summer of 2022, a Pacific Northwest IMW network synthesis document to come out. A group of us, including Ken and myself, worked with PNAMP and the Pacific Northwest IMW network on a synthesis document which rolls together conclusions, lessons learned, summaries of the IMWs across the Pacific Northwest. And in 2023, we are going to write another summary report, which will include 15 years of data. We'll start group meetings and synthesis for that document soon. And then finally, just a quick update on our funding. Current funding is received by ODFW, the North Fork John Day Watershed Council, and the Warm Springs Tribe. Funding is provided by NOAA, PSMFC, and administered by OWEB. Our current funding contract goes through June 30th, 2022, and we just submitted budgets and statements of work for a contract expected for funding through June 30th of 2023. And that is it. If there are any questions, just about a minute over.
Thanks, Casey. That was great. Yeah, if anybody has questions, feel free to raise your hand. If we don't get to them, there will be time to talk about updates in your breakout rooms later. So just hold those thoughts too if we don't get to them right now. I have not seen any questions in the chat. Ken, like you have raised your hand. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Ken Fetcher with the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. I was wondering if you could just go back to those stock recruitment curves and just explain how to interpret those. If that's okay.
Yeah,
it could help the audience.
Yeah, I didn't want to spend a ton of time on it because they are a little bit hard to interpret, but maybe Jim
can help with that.
Yeah.
And what are you looking for and why is it suggest it's density dependent? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Jim, do you want to explain?
Yes. So density dependence is shown by the declining portion of those curves. So as spawners increase, the number of offspring, this part is measured as adult recruits. That's basically the offspring adults coming back to the spawning grounds. So at high spawner densities, generally you see fewer recruits coming back per spawner. And there's a lot of noise in those curves, and that's pretty typical. And it's more typical to have more noise at the left-hand side of the spawner number versus the higher densities of spawner numbers. Because density dependence kind of overrides everything else at high spawner numbers and makes the recruit estimates by each spawner, compressed and overrides any other environmental factors out there. Does that help, Ken?
Yeah, it does. Thanks, Jim. And so where we say the upper right-hand graph with the upper Mason John Day, that the curve doesn't decline as much, and so when you see those sort of different, I don't know, slopes of the curve, does that tell you that maybe the upper Mason John Day is less density dependent?
Yeah, it would suggest that, yes. If you compare it with the Middle Fork, you could make that assumption, although the variability around that average line is pretty significant. So I wouldn't draw too much from that.
Okay. No, thanks for explaining that.
All right, well, we do have to move on to Hannah's update here, but Jim, thanks for explaining that. Casey, thanks for the great update. Again, if you have more questions, feel free. We'll have a chance for you to note what your follow-up questions are later. So just take note of those now. And Hannah, go ahead and share your screen when you're ready. It looks good. You're muted though. Oh, okay, good.
You see it? Yeah, good. Okay. So yeah, hi, I'm Hannah Latzo. I'm the John D. Basin coordinator as of October of last year, for those of you that don't know me. And I was just gonna go through a few partnership updates for everyone. So we'll start off with the 2022 Middle Fork restoration going on this year. Here's just a broad overview map of most of the Middle Fork John Day restoration projects. This map shows 9 separate projects occurring this year. And then we'll kind of just go through what each one of them entails. So first up, we have the projects through the ODFW Fish Habitat Program. They have just 2, the Little Indian Creek riparian fence, which is half a mile of fence on the U.S. Forest Service property and half a mile on private property, so a mile total of fencing. And then their other one is the Middle Fork John Day River Homes restoration riparian fence, which is another half a mile of fence on the Middle Fork John Day on private property. Next is the North Fork John Day Watershed Council. I know lots of words in this one, but they have a lot of projects going on this year. And so we'll start, they have the Middle Fork Private Lands Revegetation Project, which is protecting 25 acres of valuable floodplain habitat on the Middle Fork John Day. The first phase of this project occurring this year will be planting 5,000 plants. Next up, we have the Upshaw Creek Spring Development, which is just a spring development on private lands, and they're actually working with a new landowner, so that's exciting. And then the other 4 that they have are all in coordination with the Mount Hero National Forest. So we have the Big Creek Floodplain Habitat Restoration and Fencing, which is installing fence and around the installation of habitat structures on the floodplain and in stream, and also including plantings with that. This one's especially important because it's in a high priority watershed. Next, they have the Deep Creek Passage and Habitat Restoration Project, which is addressing a total fish passage barrier approximately 1.5 miles up the Deep Creek Road. So this project will be removing that fish passage barrier while decommissioning the road. And so they're going to put in, again, in stream and floodplain wood structures and breach the levee so they can reconnect that deep creek to its natural floodplain. Next, they have the Butte Ruby beaver restoration. And I guess these next two are just kind of an update on the continuation of these projects. So this year, that work will be happening on Beaver and Ruby Creeks. And that one will be removing 50 log weirs and again, installing that floodplain habitat and in-stream habitat and planting. And then lastly is the Camp Creek exposures and planting, also a continuation of the Camp Creek project. And this one will be installing a combination of buck and pole and wire fencing. Next, and I guess last two would be the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs project. Their big one, Vinegar to Vincent, that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. This one includes 1 mile of habitat restoration on the Middle Fork John Day River. And so this project will be addressing legacy effects with habitat complexity, intensive planting, removal of the historic railroad grade, and improving the production of all the aquatic species in the area. And then we'll just move on to some of the partnership updates. So for LiDAR training, we're still working with Dogami to set up a training for partners. I actually just got an email this morning from Rob to set up a meeting to hopefully plan this training for you all. And we do just ask if anyone would like that data still. It's kind of a big one, so it takes a couple external hard drives to get it to you, but we can totally do that. If you guys want the data, or if you also have an input about how you would like to utilize the data, you can feel free to contact me or Alex Rice. His email is located here from the North Fork John Day Watershed Council. And we can get that to you, but also trying to plan for that training. It'd be really useful to see how partners really want to utilize that data. And then more to come once we do set up a meeting date and time. Next, we have the AGOL. So we've been working with our new GIS consultant, Flow Analytics, on our partnership AGOL platform. Recently, they've gone in and color-coded each sub-watershed using the Atlas scores. So now every map easily shows the highest priority aquatic streams for restoration. There's also, so now there's new prioritization maps for each of the 15 sub-watersheds. And I was just going to say, if you do have a chance to log in and view those, each one is noted by the sub-watershed name and then priority map in the title. So they're really easy to find, and they should be on the homepage when you log in. They also created sub-basin maps. So there's a color-coded prioritization for each of the 3 sub-basins as well. We're actually really excited for to have them on board, because the AGOL tool is going to be super useful for all of our sub-basin working groups and planning future restoration projects. And if you need help logging in, I did make a login for each of the sub-basin working group leads that we can share with you. So feel free to reach out to those leads or myself if you don't have access yet. Next is the FIT pre-proposals. So the steering committee has selected a deadline for the fall 2022 FIT pre-proposals of September 15th. Pre-proposals will be going through the project tracker again this year, so you can fill out your forms in there. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And then the project tracker website is right there in case you don't know how to get to it. Next is the notification of vote. So we're using this meeting to serve as 30-day notification of vote for the steering committee positions. I'll send out an email after the meeting for all the authorized voters with the details of this. And I just wanted to show in this following list, the parentheses indicate who's currently filling that position. So the positions we have coming up are a soil and water conservation district, that's currently Herb Winters, a conservation group, which is Amanda Martino, a state agency, which is Adrian Everett from ODFW, a watershed council, which is Amy Steiner currently, a tribal position, which is John Zach, and then we, because Amy Charette just recently left, we have an at-large position that is open to fill. We are still taking nominations for this, so if you would like to nominate someone for any of those positions, please just feel free to email me and I can get them on the SurveyMonkey link. And then lastly, I just wanted to give an update about the uplands prioritization. We selected Eric Rook from Monument SWCD as the uplands consultant for the partnership uplands prioritization. Lately, we've been working with ODFW wildlife biologists across the basin to nail down important limiting factors for mule deer. And then we've also been working in conjunction with our GIS consultant to get the appropriate GIS layers tailored to those limiting factors. So once we get all of those components sorted out with the limiting factors, our plan is to have another full group meeting for that uplands prioritization meeting. So just look forward to that for that big group meeting. And that's all I have for updates. I guess I can take questions now, but we also have Marty from Blue Mountain Land Trust was going to do a quick update about Phipps Meadow in the Upper Middle Fork too.
Do you want to take questions now, or I can jump in real quick about Phipps beforehand?
Yeah, you can just jump in. I think that'd be easier.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, everybody. Just a quick update about Blue Mountain Land Trust purchase of Phipps Meadow. We are currently working through our OWEB grant application under the FIP for the land acquisition grant. And so as part of that, we've released 2 RFPs for habitat and species inventories, one for the wet meadow and the other for the forested upland portions of the property. Those RFPs went out on the John Day Basin Partnership listserv. And so please feel free to forward those on to your contractors, or please send us anyone that you think would be a good consultant for us to reach out to. We released those last week and are hoping to have proposals back by May 23rd so we can spend the summer with collecting our baseline data. We've also had Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs has been out on the property and has installed 5 temperature loggers, an air temperature logger, and 2 flow gauges, as well as conducted some late spring now, it feels like, drone flights of the property to get the conditions on the ground from the air. So continuing to work through data collection and getting our baseline documentation ready for closing that project up.
Great, thanks, Marty. Thanks, Hannah. I haven't seen any questions in the chat pop up yet, but if you've got one on your mind, feel free to raise your hand. If you don't know how to raise your hand, you can just talk. Yeah. Okay, well, I guess no questions, Hannah. If you think of any, feel free to save those for our breakout rooms later, or I'm sure Hannah would love an email from you. Great. Okay, so we'll just keep going then on our agenda. Next up, we have Matt Kaler from Oregon State University talking about juvenile Chinook floodplain accessibility and dispersal from reds. So Matt, great. Got it pulled up there. Thank you.
All right, think everyone can hear me. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, my name's Matt Kaler. I'm a postdoc at OSU and work really closely with Seth White's group at the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. And so today I'm going to talk about or talk on behalf of a bunch of collaborators, many of them on this call, about two projects we've been working on in the Middle Fork. And the first is looking at floodplain habitat and trying to model when and where floodplains are accessible, and then linking that to some aspects of a juvenile Chinook ecology, including emergence timing. And then the second one is, I think folks are more familiar with, is looking at or trying to estimate juvenile Chinook dispersal from spawning locations to floodplain habitat and to summer rearing habitats. So I have a bunch to get through, so I'm just gonna jump right into the first project here, I think. There it goes. So for the floodplain project, before I start, I want to acknowledge the various collaborators on this project, which include Morgan Bond and George Pess. And much of what I present today, that most of it has been heavy lifting for Morgan. So he's been doing the vast majority of the modeling. Casey Justice and Seth White are from CritFic, Joey Lemansky, and then Johnny Armstrong. And this project's still in its fairly early stages. We just started analyzing data, so this is by no means an exhaustive list, and will likely expand as we continue. So why are we looking at floodplains? And there's a number of reasons. One is just an increased recognition of the importance floodplains can provide, both for juvenile salmonids, so in terms of high flow refuge, increased growth opportunities and food resources. And then obviously for riparian species and for flood protection and reducing stream power. So a lot of different, they provide a lot of important opportunities for salmon and for the stream ecosystem in general. But they're highly degraded and disconnected. And because of that, there's been increased restoration focus. And obviously you can see that in the Middle Fork. But they're also really expensive. So given that there's increased focus on restoring them, but they're expensive, we wanted to provide some information on where they may be most utilized, or where floodplains may be most beneficial for juvenile salmonids. So the goal is to develop a framework for that, and that combines both aspects of floodplain inundation and then aspects of the juvenile salmon ecology. So what that looks like is first modeling floodplain inundation, which is basically just when and where floodplains are accessible. And this has been the bulk of what's been done so far, mostly by Morgan's modeling. The next step is then to overlay emergence timing. So we previously, in a different study, we modeled emergence timing using temperature data, annual temperature data, and spawning survey data. So this is actually when fish can access them. So if a floodplain is flooded, but the fish haven't emerged yet, obviously they aren't going to be able to use them. Then we want to incorporate red distribution. So looking at where spawning locations are or where the spawning distribution is within the basin relative to floodplains. And overall, our goal is to do this in the Middle Fork, and then also expand into the Grand Ronde Basin and do this in the Upper Grand Ronde and Catherine Creek. And right now, Morgan has finished up results for the Middle Fork, and we've done some other preliminary analyses that I'll share today. And then Morgan's cranking away right now on the Upper Grand Ronde and Catherine Creek. So getting into Morgan's process here of modeling inundation, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher some of this, and Morgan could explain it much better. But if you have any questions, you can follow up with me or with Morgan, and I'm sure he'd be happy to explain it better than I can. But the overall approach is that he uses satellite imagery. So you can see in these two images, low flow on the left and higher flow on the right. And as flows increase and spread out over the floodplain, you can see that in these satellite images. And so Morgan can use those and use the satellite imagery to estimate wetted area across a range of images. So he obtains imagery, and one of the keys of obtaining imagery is to try and encompass a range of flows, or imagery from dates with a range of flows. So not just all low flow or high flow, but try and really get a range. He then took the stream network and divided it into 200-meter stream segments, and then created a polygon, a floodplain polygon for each of those. Then he classifies wetted area for each image and for each polygon. So a lot of different images and polygons going on here. And I'll explain this process more in the next slide. From that, he can build relationships between discharge on the date that the images were taken and the estimated wetted area on that date. And then you can use those relationships. If you know the relationship between discharge and wetted area, you can then take continuous discharge data for the middle fork. This is the Britter gauge. And then you can use that to predict wetted area across or continuously. So for each day, for each polygon. So this is just an example here showing a satellite image. And the blue polygon there is one of the polygons that Morgan developed, and uses high resolution multiband satellite imagery, which pretty much means it uses 7 bands, so not just the normal visual that we're used to, but also infrared. And he has an approach to classifying what is wetted and what is not, as well as other features such as bars. So the blue here is the wetted areas, and the yellow is bars. And as you can imagine, given how many polygons there are and how many images, this can be really time consuming. And so Morgan's developed a process to speed this along, and he uses a deep learning modeling process. And again, I'm sure I'm butchering this, but the overall approach is that he will take an image and hand digitize, so add a bunch of points and tell it what is wetted and what is not a wetted surface. And then he feeds that into the model. So he tries to train it and then uses the model to be able to predict using an image that he didn't digitize what is wetted and what is not. And it requires a lot of training this model, doing this hand digitizing, and then seeing what the model predicts, and then going back through and being able to look at errors and refeed it new data, and just kind of keep circling back and back until it improves model accuracy. And so it takes a lot of time at the beginning in order to get it to be accurate. But once he's able to do this, then it can predict a really large area over a very short amount of time relative to how long it would take by hand. So this is just showing the images that Morgan has been able to acquire. So this is just day of the year on the x-axis and the average flow for that day of the year for the last 20 years or 25 years or so. And the blue lines here are the images. I guess it's the discharge on that date for the image. And what you notice kind of right away here is there's not a ton of images from this period of high flow in the spring. And it's because it tends to be a period when there's a lot more clouds, and the images are, although there were satellite images taken, they're cloudy and can't be used. So it's kind of a challenge to get a lot of images that span this range and flow. So that's one of the kind of caveats or disadvantages is it can't see through clouds, and it can be challenging with some habitat types like emergent vegetation, like flooded meadows and flooded forests. And then in addition, the images are, we pretty much have to take what we get. We can't tell the satellites what to do or anything. So you just have to take what's available. And because of this, it kind of limits evaluating restoration. So it'd be really nice to look at images before, say, a project like Oxbow and after, but it just wasn't available. And so we ended up for areas that have seen major restoration, we try to just take images from after restoration. In the future, that might change as more images become available, but at this point, it can't really be used to look at restoration. So I'm going to show just kind of how this plays out. This here is, these points are from a single polygon, and there were 5 images of, or 5 images available for that polygon. And so the X is the discharge on that date of the image, and the Y is the Morgan's estimated wetted area. And so we can fit a relationship to this, which is just a simple linear connection between these points. And as you can see, there's a pretty big gap between these 2 points out here. And the relationship could actually go up and over, or it could look very different. But unfortunately, we just don't have the resolution to be able to look at that. So we kind of have to take what's available with the available images. And although there's some error in this, we think it's overall a pretty good process. We can then take this continuous flow data from Ritter. I think this one's for 2014. And then for each day of the year, we can get the discharge, and then we can come over here and plug that discharge into this relationship and get an estimate of wetted area on that day. So we can repeat this over and over for each day of the year. And eventually we can get a continuous prediction of area over time. And as you'll notice right away, the lowest values here are 1800 or so, which represent what's in the main channel. And so Morgan went through and created a polygon layer for bank full area within each, or for the entire Middle Fork. And so we can take that estimate, which again, there's going to be some error, but we think overall it's pretty decent estimate. And then we can subtract the wetted area or the bank full area from the wetted area to get an estimate of what's actually flooded versus what's in the main stem. And obviously anything below that bank full area is just going to be main channel and not floodplain, and would be 0. So it translates to then these predictions of what we think is actually floodplain area. And we can look at that over time and then do that for all 275 reaches. And then I think we have around 9 or 10 years of data. And it ends up looking, getting kind of complex and looking something like this, where you can visualize this in a 3D figure where we have time here, so increasing in time over the year, and then the spatial component here with the river kilometer. And if we spin this a little bit, you can kind of look at that spatial component a bit more. And again, I think this is for 2014, but it pretty much tracks out where the areas that you would expect. So that the FCA, Oxbow, and kind of Dunstan and downstream are the areas that are really peaking in terms of major floodplain areas. But so this is pretty complex here, and we're having a hard time figuring out then how to translate this or how to link this to emergence timing, given that there's data across both time and across space. And what we ended up doing is taking for each year, we ended up taking, and for each polygon, we ended up taking the median of floodplain area over time and getting an estimate of what day that occurred on. And so it looks like this, where we have river kilometer on the x-axis. And now this here, this y-axis is the median day of the year, or the day of the year where median floodplain wetted area occurred on. And it's generally around like day 175 for this particular year. I need to go back and check this point here, as it seems like quite an outlier. And then we can add our emergence timing predictions to that. So again, this is from a different study, but we had temperature sensors at these 6 locations, and it varied by year. And then we had estimated emergence timing using spawning data and this temperature. And the main thing to notice is that downstream emergence timing, or median emergence timing, was later than upstream and got earlier and earlier as you moved upstream. So we could then fit a relationship to this so that we can predict emergence at any river kilometer rather than just at these 6 sites that had temperature data. So the next figure I'm going to show is just the difference between this the estimate of emergence timing and the estimate of median wetted area. And it looks like this, where same thing as before. Downstream emergence tended to be, around 25 to 50 days after median floodplain inundation. And upstream, that number got lower and lower until eventually emergence was predicted to occur prior to median floodplain inundation. And there's about a 70-day difference here, which is a lot of time, or a lot of time difference between some of these sites. And that may translate into some important things. So it may translate into differences in growth opportunities. So upstream, if those fish have an extra 50 or 70 days to utilize floodplains, that could translate to big differences in growth and ultimately size. And in addition, the timing of median floodplain inundation is going to pretty much correlate with the timing of peak flows. So in those downstream areas, those fish are going to be emerging after peak flows, whereas in the upstream areas, they're likely to be emerging either right around peak flows or just before peak flows. And up there, it may be more important to have floodplains to provide those that flow refuge, considering they're emerging during those high flows. So I'm just going to go through two kind of last steps here, which is adding some of the spawning distribution data. And this is just showing for this particular year, just showing the proportion of reds by river kilometer. And we can then take each red and estimate emergence timing at each red using that linear relationship I showed before. And we can end up getting a population level estimate of median emergence timing. And in this particular, in this particular year, median emergence was roughly 30 days after floodplain inundation. So you can imagine if the red distribution was shifted upstream because emergence was earlier up there, this whole distribution would shift closer to median floodplain inundation. And this is just very preliminary. We've kind of been working on this in the last month or so, so this isn't finalized by any means, just one approach we've taken at this point. So our next steps are obviously to expand to Upper Grand Bahn and Catherine Creek, and Morgan's currently working on analyzing this imagery. And as I said, this is very preliminary, and so we're thinking of additional ways to link floodplain inundation with emergence timing and spawning distributions. And then for the Middle Fork, we eventually want to incorporate dispersal patterns, which will be the topic of the next talk, and look at how far fish are dispersing to floodplains. So ODFW and Warm Springs have been collecting fry from floodplains both last year and again this year, and we're hoping to have those genetic results sometime this summer. Okay, so moving on to the dispersal study. Again, a lot of people have contributed toward the study, including ODFW with Lindsay, Joe Lemansky, Melody, and Ian, as well as a lot of others that have done field work. With CritVic, there's Seth, Aaron Collins, and Sean Narum with the Hagerman Genetics Lab. Stefan with Warm Springs, as well as a lot of people who helped out with field work, and Johnny Armstrong at OSU. And then similar to the other project, this is very early stages and likely to expand as we continue. So some of the questions we want to look at with dispersal is how far they're dispersing to floodplains, as I mentioned before, which is really going to influence kind of how close to floodplains need to be to corresponding locations, or how does that influence whether they're utilized or the degree to which they're utilized. And then in terms of looking at dispersal from spawning locations to summer rearing habitats, there's a bunch of questions we can ask. Some of them are for each tributary, where do fish come from, and how important are those tributaries to fish from different parts of the watershed, and gets into where would restoration projects be most effective given how far fish are dispersing and the distribution of spawning locations within the basin. So the challenge with looking at dispersal is, in the spring, it's really hard to sample fry, given high flows and they're spread out and often exhibit nocturnal behavior. And if you could capture them efficiently to get enough fish, they're too small to tag with pit tags. And even if you could, during this time or this life stage, mortality is really high and recapture would be very low. So it'd be really difficult to do in a conventional tagging approach. So we're using an approach where we use genetics as our tag or as our tracer. So we sampled adults in 2020 from spawning locations. So this was usually carcasses, and we obtained either a fin clip or a hard tissue sample for genetic analysis. ODFW and Warm Spring sampled fry in spring of 21 and 22. And then we sampled par last summer. And so the results today will just be on the par because that's what we've gotten back from the genetics lab. And the fry data will be coming later. And then Aaron and Sean with Hagerman Genetics Lab genotyped the parents or the adults and the fry and the par, and then use pair attention analysis to assign juveniles to adults. And if we know a location of the juveniles and we know a location of where that adult was sampled, we can look at dispersal. So this is just showing in 2020, this is showing the distribution of reds across the basin. There were 162 reds in this particular year. We ended up getting 141 carcasses from or throughout the Middle Fork. And for the most part, where we got carcasses was pretty decently represented the distribution of reds. You can see some areas down here, like near Camp Creek and Big Boulder, where there were a few reds and we weren't able to get any carcass samples. Of those carcass samples, 111 were successfully genotyped, meaning that they were genotyped to a level that met the lab standard of quality. And this is actually pretty good to get 111, given that the DNA degrades really quickly as soon as these fish die and begin decomposing. So we are actually pretty happy with 111 out of the 141. This next one is showing where ODFW and Warm Springs sampled fry. This is just for 2020. And this more or less lines up with that 3D figure I showed before of the peaks in floodplain or areas of lots of floodplain connectivity. And so around 1,100 were sampled, and hopefully we'll be getting this data back, hopefully in the next couple months here. For sampling par during the summer, our plan was to go to 30 main stem sites. And these we set this up to be relatively evenly distributed throughout the main stem, and to get 100 fish per site for a total of 3,000 fish. And then we wanted to sample 4 tributaries and get around 200 fish per tributary for a total of 800, resulting in a total of 3,800 par. Didn't quite work out. As you know, last summer was really hot and we pretty much just couldn't find any fish downstream of Big Boulder. And we snorkel a lot of these sites and there was either nothing there or just a handful of fish. So we ended up only getting 20 main stem sites sampled. Only 17 of these had over 40 par. And this resulted in 1,600, a little over 1,600 samples. So not quite the 3,000 we had planned, but it was also a strange year where we think the distribution would shifted up farther upwards in the watershed. And as you can see, we got a lot of good samples down in the Oxbow and FCA area, but getting upstream of Vinegar, there were a few sites where we just couldn't find fish or could only find a few fish. And then in tributaries, we ended up sampling way more than the 4 that we planned. We ended up sampling 9 tributaries. And part of this was because it seemed like fish were using tributaries more than we expected. And part of it was because the main stem was the temperature was so hot and the main stem was so warm that we just couldn't sample the main stem a lot of days and dedicated a bit more effort to the tributaries. So we ended up getting 200 or more samples in most of them. So Clear and Davis, Dead Cow, Butte, Granite Boulder, Big Boulder. And in Camp Creek, we could only get around 26, and Beaver, we couldn't get as many as well. and then around 400 in vinegar. So getting into some of the results, this is just showing here that we sent in a total of around 3,500 PAR samples, and 1,750 of those were successfully genotyped and then paired to an adult, which is way higher than we expected. I was thinking we'd get maybe 300 to 600 or so. So to get 1,700 was really good and give us a really good sample size to look at dispersal. Of those, 788 were from the main stem, and this is just showing the number of fish per site that were successfully paired. And it generally was over 25 or 30 for most sites. There were a few up here just upstream of Davis that only had a couple. But overall, pretty good sample size. When we look at tributaries, again, really good sample size. 961 of the samples we got from tributaries were successfully paired to an adult. And mostly tributaries had over 100. So Clear, Davis, Dead Cow, Vinegar, Granite Boulder, and Big Boulder and Buttes close to 100. Less so in Beaver Creek and Camp Creek, but really good sample sizes to look at dispersal to tributaries, and for each tributary, we can look at where fish originated from. This here is just showing the overall breakdown of how many individuals were assigned to each female. So we had 67 females that were adult females that were successfully genotyped. Of those, 57 had at least one PAR assigned to them, so 10 had no PAR, and the rest had one or more. And what I think is really interesting is that 50% of the PAR could be assigned to just the top 13 females. So just the ones up or to the right of this made up at least 50%. So it's a pretty disproportionate reproductive success, or I guess our samples seem to suggest that. Pretty similar story for males. 46 males were genotyped. Of these, 35 had at least one PAR assigned to them, so 11 had none. And then here, 50% of the PAR were assigned to just 5 of the males. So the top 5 males accounted for over 50% of our samples, which is pretty disproportionate. Getting into the actual dispersal results. And I put a disclaimer down here. So I'm using the term dispersal, but that's kind of in quotes because we don't actually know the red location. We know where we sampled the adult, and we're assuming that the adult was near the red, which is probably more likely for females than males. But that's just an assumption going forward. So not exactly dispersal, but that's how I'm going to refer to it. And so this figure is showing distance moved. And it's a little confusing, but to the left here is that the PAR moved downstream, or that the adult was an upstream origin, and vice versa to the right. The PAR moved upstream, the adult was located downstream. The black line is 0, and the red line is the median. So the main points here that there wasn't really a strong upstream or downstream bias for PAR that were captured in main stem or in tributaries. In general, it was pretty close to 0 and not really biased in either direction, which I find pretty surprising, especially given that how few fish were downstream of Big Boulder. I thought there would have been much more of an upstream bias. Something that's interesting is over 50% of the fish, even though the median was pretty close to 0, over 50% of fish moved greater than 2 kilometers, which is a lot more than is reported in other studies. It's generally believed that fish don't move as much. So this suggesting they're moving quite a bit, even though a lot didn't. And then some were paired to adults that were over 20 kilometers away. So some pretty far distances we observed. I'm not showing this figure, but I briefly looked at whether there were differences in dispersal for PAR that were paired to a male versus a female. And I didn't really see anything. I didn't statistically analyze this yet, but I didn't see much in terms of just looking at the distributions. And then if we break that down into each tributary, so again, pretty good sample sizes for most of these except Camp Creek and Beaver. But we can see for most tributaries, the median dispersal distance was pretty close to the confluence. So for like Butte, fish were pretty, the median was pretty close to 0. Same for Dead Cow, Davis. And that just translates to that in each tributary, fish were more likely to originate from spawning locations nearby, suggesting that yeah, there's kind of a local, most of the fish are originating relatively locally. But also fish came from a pretty wide range. So if you look at any of these, you know, for Clear Creek, for example, fish originated, some, or at least a proportion of them originated from up to, you know, 20 kilometers away. For some tributaries, there was a bias towards upstream origin, so downstream movement. And this would be like Granite Boulder. So a lot of these fish were originated from upstream. Same with Camp Creek, although we didn't really have any adult samples from the Camp Creek area. So this one's kind of an outlier we're gonna have to look into more. And then others had a bias towards downstream origin, such as Big Boulder and Clear Creek. And that makes a lot of sense for Clear Creek since it's so much farther up in the watershed. I just have a couple more to show here and then I'm going to wrap up. This is just an example of some of the data I'm going to share. I can send out a document to everyone next week that'll have all the sites, and you can click through and look at, for each site, you can look at where those fish originated from. So each of these points is one of the reds, or not one of the reds, one of the adult samples, and the color just shows how many fish were paired to that particular adult. So this is for a site down in the Oxbow, and just shows you the overall distribution, or the overall locations of where they were paired to and the distribution. So I'll send this out next week, and you can play through the sites, including some of the tributary sites. And then I'll also send out these figures here that show, kind of flip what I just showed before. And instead of being the site and looking at where the parents originated, this is now showing the parent in red, so the adult sample, and then the colors here are the sites and how many fish from that site were paired to that particular adult. So I'll send something out that has probably like the top 10 adults, and you can play through it and look at yeah, where fish from each adult came from. And with that, I want to acknowledge everyone that's helped out on this project. There were so many people helped out on sampling, particularly the genetics project. Tons of help from ODFW, Warm Springs, and CritFic, and other folks in John Day. And also want to thank all the funding agencies and funding sources that made all this work possible. With that, I think I'm over and can take any questions.
All right, thanks, Matt. That was great. We are a couple minutes behind schedule. I know we had a break plan right now, so if anybody wants to take your break, go ahead. But we'll have a few questions here if that works. Matt, there's one question in the chat from Eric Merton. When you started the dispersal section, he asked, stable, oh, sorry, Alex, this is from Alex. But it was answered by Eric Merton. I don't know if you want to address those comments right there. So Alex asked, could stable isotopes be used to track dispersal of fry? Eric responded, stable isotopes inform diet and trophic position and the analyses I'm familiar with rather than origin. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so stable isotopes have been used to look at that, not so much as dispersal, but where fish originated from, like using strontium. But I think in general, that's you need each location in the watershed to have a really distinct strontium signature, or have some sort of a gradient throughout the watershed. I have no idea. I think that plays out on like larger spatial scales than a basin like the Middle Fork, but I don't really know.
Great. Any other questions? Or Alex or Eric, if you want to chime in, feel free to unmute and talk. Great. Ken has a question. Go ahead.
Hey, Ken.
Hey, Matt, thanks for walking us through that. It's really interesting to see how the juveniles move and where you're finding them based on where the adults were sampled. One of the things that you were sort of objectives early on, you were saying, well, this could help inform restoration. And so can you walk us through that? I mean, maybe it's premature, but based on what you're seeing, like what kind of recommendations could you make based on
Yeah. So
some?
I thought about that and wanted to provide some, but we got the genetics data back really like recently. I think it was, I'm not sure quite how long ago, but haven't really had a ton of time to really dig into this data. So I didn't want to kind of jump the gun, but it will have a lot of implications, particularly, well, yeah, there's some other things I've looked at, I guess, that I really want to dig into before I start
Okay.
making
Yeah.
sort of recommendations. That it's just really preliminary at this point. But those will come next couple months.
Yeah. No, that's totally fair. And I expected that. I think just connecting those dots where as you continue to work with the data and get more comfortable with that, I think it'll be helpful.
Yeah, and there's a lot
just-
more to come too with so each of those fish, or the vast majority of them, if they were over 55 millimeters, also got a pit tag. And so eventually we'll be able to look at other things like movement after or after we captured them, and potentially look at survival as well, and how that varies throughout the basins and tributary, or throughout the main stem and tributaries. So yeah, there's a lot more data to come that I think we should look at the big picture and kind of tie everything together before
Okay.
drawing too many conclusions.
No, that makes sense. And thanks for saying that as far as the additional data that can come to bear in the future.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
Yep.
All right, well, I'm not seeing too many other questions in the chat or people with their hands raised. So let's go ahead and take a 7-minute break. We'll come back at 12:30. For, I believe next up is Stephen Kelly's talk on the MFIMW water temperature trend analysis. So see you in 7 minutes. Thank you. All right, so we're gonna start coming back together. Next up, we have Stefan Kelly with the water temperature trend analysis in the MFIMW. Stefan, would you like to go ahead and share your screen?
Yes. Okay, can you see that all right and also hear me all right?
Yes, that's great.
Perfect. Okay, I'm Stephen Kelly. Good morning. I'm with the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Reservation of Oregon. I've been with the tribes for a few years now and mostly involved on the monitoring side of things since I've been here, which has given me ample opportunity to contribute to the Middle Fork IMW through the tribe's efforts. And part of that is that we maintain a network of temperature loggers in the Middle Fork, along with a bunch of other agencies, which all of those data end up in the Middle Fork IMW temperature database. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about that temperature monitoring and also present some kind of preliminary or exploratory trend analysis. So Casey mentioned earlier that water temperature was identified as a primary limiting factor for the Middle Fork in the 10-year IMW summary reports. It's warm out there. It's really hot, and so that's because of a variety of habitat degradation and land use changes through time and things like that. And so there's been a pretty extensive monitoring effort out there. Last I checked, there were 252 unique temperature logger locations that had been where data had been collected and is now in the temperature database. And this is kind of what that looks like on the right. We have a temperature logger housed in a solar shield and anchored to a steel cable on the bank here. Where it's collecting water temperature, looks to be in the summertime here. And so water temperature is it's a common restoration objective, right? Mitigating temperature, whether it's through riparian restoration or increased groundwater input, things like that. That's something that that folks use a lot in their restoration narratives. And so while this temperature data has been used quite a bit for modeling purposes and for projecting potential climate scenarios, there's been a little bit less work done on kind of that retrospective look at temperature change since data was started to be collected out there. And so this is the Middle Fork watershed, and this is every location that shows up in the database right now. So it's a lot of locations. There's, as I said, over 250 of these. Most of them concentrated in the upper half of the basin, which makes sense. That's kind of where the IMW focus area is. And with some of these tributaries getting a lot of attention as well, such as Camp Creek or Big Creek over here. Also a lot of a high concentration of loggers in some areas where we've performed restoration, Oxbow and up and around the FCA, which are both tribal properties. So these are autonomous data loggers that are deployed. A lot of them are hobo loggers. I know many of you are familiar with those, and they collect ambient temperature at 1 hour intervals or whatever you set them at. 1 hour is pretty common. Many of them are deployed year round, and they're managed by, as I said, various agencies, North Fork Watershed Council and OEFW and the U.S. Forest Service, as well as the tribes. And so for this analysis, I kind of wanted to pare down that pretty expansive data set to something that was a little bit more manageable, just for a kind of an initial attempt at looking at trend. And so I used the criteria of a minimum of 8 years of data collection and a designation as still active. So these are loggers that are still being maintained in the system. And that got that site list down to 56 sites. With a pretty decent distribution between main stem sites and main stem Middle Fork sites and tributary locations. And so that's what this looks like. And it kind of reflects what the distribution of the overall logger network looks like, but there's the purple points here are main stem loggers, and then orange are some of our tributary loggers. I put it through a QA/QC, which is just a standard QA/QC that we perform internally for our own temperature data. Just looking for large temperature changes, hourly, daily, or day to day. Also very small temperature changes, which could indicate that the logger was buried in sediment and experiencing some sort of insulation effect. Very low temperatures, temperatures below zero, very high temperatures, things that might indicate the water's out of the water and kind of reflecting air temperature. Remove what was flagged as bad data, and then just use months that had a full complement of good data for the analysis. Then I kind of broke it out by July, August, and September, which are 3 of our hottest months, pretty important time of the year for juvenile rearing and also starting to get into the spawning season. And I summarized within months by cumulative degree hours. That being, as a super simplified example, if the temperature reading at the top of the hour is 10 degrees, that's 10 degree hours. And if you carried that through for a full day, that'd be 240 degree hours. And then I just did a very simple linear regression through time for that monthly cumulative DH against year. And so this is kind of what our results look like. I have it kind of broken out. The number of significant trends is out of 56 sites. The number of increasing trends and the number of decreasing trends, and then where those were located, whether they were main stem or tributary. And so you can kind of see that we had 8 significant trends in July, and then a bit fewer in August, and only 1 in September. And you can see the split between main stem and tributary sites there. But I think it's useful to look at this spatially and kind of see how these cluster, if they do cluster. And I have some regional climate data here in the top right, just to show what air temperatures have been like since 2008, which is the earliest year of record that shows up in this particular analysis. So we are seeing a warming trend in July. And we do also see a few of our sites are decreasing in their cumulative degree hours over that time. A few are increasing, and we also see that most of them are not exhibiting any sort of significant trend. Here we have August, a similar map. Again, warming trend in August through this time period, and a few less significant trends. There's actually 2 that are right on top of each other in Little Indian Creek up here. And again, with a lot of these sites having no trend. In September, just a single location decreasing in temperature. September also seems to be cooling over this time frame. So then I did something very similar but slightly different, looking at exceedance. So Oregon DEQ sets kind of these thresholds for various exceedance levels that are that relate to they relate to fish, in a biological sense. So we have egg degradation exceedance and migration barrier exceedance. And I was looking at juvenile rearing exceedance, which is the 18 degrees. So kind of looking at the amount of time that these sites spend above the middle blue line during these timeframes, and then defining a degree hour as the amount, the number of degrees spent over 18, and for the amount of time. So 19 degrees for 1 hour would be 1 degree hour over the exceedance level. And then again, just doing a pretty simple linear regression. And we see a few more significant trends in this response metric, and up to 8 in July, 7 in August, and still only 1 in September. We see a lot of these in tributaries, but a couple are occurring in the main stem. And it's also worth noting that there are multiple sites for each time period that exhibit no exceedance over that 18-degree juvenile rearing threshold. And this is what that looks like. Again, July is a warming month through time since 2008. And we do see, a few main stem locations that are decreasing in their exceedance levels. And the purple spots here are areas that are not exhibiting any exceedance based on this metric. We have August as well, a few more that are increasing, red here, and some of these sites that were significant in July are having no significant trend in August. And then September, we see a whole bunch of sites that are not contributing any exceedance, mostly, in fact, entirely in the tributaries. So I think that the temperature data set is a kind of a seemingly simple data set, but when you try to really dive into the details of what you want your response metric to be and what is useful, it can become fairly quickly complicated. So, you know, I chose to use degree hours and then degree hours over a specific threshold for this analysis, but folks in the past have looked at 7-day average daily max or just daily maximums or delta temperature. You could even consider the amount of time that a given site spends in optimal growth conditions as a response. And I think that there would be use in a larger conversation about what's useful for biologists and restoration practitioners, because a lot of these metrics were kind of borrowed from their regulatory metrics that were kind of borrowed from DEQ and might not be the most applicable to everything that we do. Comparisons, I showed tributary versus main stem here just because that was a simple and straightforward comparison. But if you kind of bin these locations into restoration treatments, you could maybe start to look at how certain trends cluster within a treatment type, which would be really interesting for us. And that just requires a little bit more legwork that I couldn't quite do before this presentation. You can incorporate flow and air temperature actually into the analysis portion, and then kind of broadening your criteria to fully incorporate all or more of the monitoring locations that are suitable for analysis. And then also, of course, considering more complex modeling techniques to kind of get at this. That's all I have. I do want to say thank you to everyone that collects temperature data out there, and also to Javen at the North Fork for doing a great job in managing the database, because it's super important. And then also to a couple of our former employees, Joe Lemansky and Fred Heft, from whose code I borrowed heavily for this. And that's all I have. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Stefan. Looks like Amy Unthank has her hand raised. Go ahead and unmute, Amy.
Yes, Stefan, this is Amy Unthank from the Forest Service. I was just wondering if you could try to explain a little more a declining temperature in July. Are you thinking that's in a restoration area, or talk to us a little bit more about what that signifies to you, why that is?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it's something that I haven't looked into, and I'm not sure I could fully answer that for you. One of those locations in July is located at the bottom of the Vincent to Caribou Restoration Reach, which is encouraging. It's kind of hard to, without doing a little bit of a deeper dive, to kind of parse out why some of these trends might be happening, because these systems are, I mean, it's kind of complex, right? Because the response at any given location also depends on potentially a suite of actions that occur upstream. And so it's really hard for me to say whether or not that is directly due to restoration or not.
Great, thanks. There's a question in the chat from Eric wondering if you have thoughts on the validity of the Norwest model predictions based on your own analyses.
I'm really not familiar enough with the Norwest model predictions to give an informed response on that.
All right. Oh, Ken, question from Ken. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. I'm really glad you're continuing to pick up, like you said, on the work that your predecessors have done, and it really does underscore the value of the data management that, you know, the North Fork John Day Watershed Council has done to allow you to kind of run that code more efficiently and consistently. And so it really is a team effort, I think, and you underscore that. And I think if I could just add a few things, as Javen Bailey at the North Fork John Day Watershed Council works on the macroinvertebrate data set. She's wanting to identify the restoration that's occurred at the macroinvertebrate monitoring sites to help interpret the results, and that could benefit you at some of those temperature sites, you know, if they're in close proximity, to be able to get at what you were saying with Amy's question. And I totally agree with, it's not just like what's right next to that logger, but it's also upstream. So appreciate you emphasizing that. And then that question that Eric had, I believe those Norwest model predictions are based on climate change predictions. So they go out a certain amount of time frame based on, you know, model predictions of a warming climate essentially. And so it would be interesting to look at that sort of in context, you know, like, hey, these are expecting to show a warming and this is what we're seeing, or something to that effect. I'm not sure if that helps with Eric's question.
Yeah, Eric, do you want to step in too? Do you have thoughts on that, or?
Sure. Yeah, just exactly like you were saying. It sounds like a great data set that you got here. So an opportunity to compare and contrast, you know, see if the how well the model is predicting things.
No, I think that would be a great next step. I mean, I think there's a lot of room to build on this kind of initial attempt, and to kind of incorporate those other models and data sets into this.
Right. So there's one more question in the chat. And then I also see Javen's hand is raised there. So yeah, just real quick, it looks like Bobby Jones wanted to know how you dealt with the fact that temperature data often has missing records due to logger loss or other errors.
Yeah, totally. That is definitely part of temperature monitoring. So, you know, part of the reason that for my initial criteria, I selected a wide range of years of activity is because you do sometimes have data gaps in there. And so I mentioned during the QA/QC process that if I didn't have what I defined as quality or good data, I didn't use that month's data in the analysis. So there could be a scenario where data was collected starting in 2008, but a couple of years of data wasn't included in the actual regression analysis. And so if you have data loss to a point where you can't sufficiently perform a linear regression or something like that, then that kind of precludes you from doing it. But just, you know, trying to, at least in this scenario, have as many data points available as possible was something I was trying to do.
Great. And then Javen, you got your hand raised. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks, Steph. That was really interesting. I was wondering if you could share kind of a summary with the group, or at least the IMW group, of your results, particularly just which logger locations you found that had trends. That would be really interesting to see.
Yeah, definitely, Javen. That's not a problem. We can definitely bring that up, and I could put something together before perhaps the next subgroup meeting or something like that.
Great, thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much. That was really helpful. Looks like, oh, you got a thumbs up there from Ken. Nice job. Okay, so next up, Casey is going to share with us an update on the restoration inventory for the MFIMW. So yeah, Casey, take it away.
All right, we'll try and share this again. Before I start, I just want to say thanks again, Stefan, for sharing that data. And yes, we'll get that on a future monthly meeting and start talking about the water temperature data. And it's a good segue To mention restoration, I'm going to give a brief update on the restoration inventory in the Middle Fork. And Hannah already kind of gave some updates on it. So on some of the restoration happening. So this should go pretty quickly. If I can get my screen shared here. Oops. What are you seeing here?
Yeah, we see the presenter mode. Usually if I
Okay.
start it playing and then I share my screen, that
Yeah.
doesn't happen, but it's
Yep.
also not that bad.
I just need to swap monitors here. Just give me a sec. I think if I just change monitors, I can make this work right. Okay.
Yes, looks good.
Okay. All right. I just had to, swap monitors. All right. I'm going to give a brief update on the IMW restoration inventory. I guess first I'll just thank all of the restoration partners and the funding agencies that are funding the restoration in the IMW area. And thanks to everybody who provided me with your restoration metrics and data, and to Adrian with ODFW for helping me with this process. So the restoration inventory, we have been collecting metric data on restoration projects since the inception of the IMW. And I recently started another kind of update process in last year, updated in 2022. I'm still waiting on data for a few projects and QA/QC. And so the data has been compiled from numerous sources, including some of the big project databases like OWRI, BPA's database, the project tracker with John Day Basin Partnership. We maintain it with the IMW as a spreadsheet, and I currently am the holder on that spreadsheet. But the kind of structure and the metrics were decided upon by the IMW group or a subgroup of folks in 2016 to be used in our 10-year summary report. I also currently have an AGO map of points available for restoration projects from 2017 to 2021. Right now, it's just points and not reaches. But I can start working on sort of getting reaches and doing some QA/QC to make sure that the locations are correct. And if you're interested in this inventory, just ask me and I can send it along with, some metadata and caveats. And so thinking of Javen and Stefan both with macroinvertebrate data and the water temperature data, we've got to start here on the mapping and the reaches, an update from the last restoration inventory in 2017. Just some highlights. I'm only talking about right now the 2017 to 21 restoration projects. I counted 39 projects, $4 million, 34 in-stream miles treated, 40 linear miles of riparian stream treated, 58 passage barriers removed, over 70,000 riparian plantings. That's a conservative estimate because that wasn't a metric that we originally pulled out of the restoration project data. So just something that I kind of started asking about, seeing how many riparian plantings are going in. Numerous roads relocated and over 2,000 structures placed in stream. So just a little breakdown by activity type. This is just sort of showing the breakdown of the metrics that we looked at, and just sort of a count of the 39 projects, how many projects included these types of restoration activities. And so these can occur, more than one activity, of course, per restoration project, but you can see that a big chunk of the projects included in-stream habitat work, riparian management work, and upland management and fish passage barriers. Here is just kind of a quick look at a map of the restoration projects from 2017 to 2021. You can see it covers quite a big expanse of the IMW area. Also have coded these by kind of their primary restoration type for in-stream, riparian, fish passage, floodplain, upland, or road relocation. And again, this is just the primary type that stood out in the metrics that were provided to us. Hannah already sort of talked about the upcoming restoration projects, so I won't worry too much about this, going into too much detail, but quite a few projects upcoming, so pretty exciting. And that's what I have. So I promised this one would be shorter than the IMW update. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And I will stop sharing. And thank you again to everybody that has provided data for this inventory. It's a constant work in progress. Yeah, Ken?
Hi, Casey. One of the questions I had in the spreadsheet that you're maintaining, does it have still like the Latin longs of the project location? So even though it's in a spreadsheet, you could convert it to spatial data.
Right. Yeah. So that's the map that I showed, is the downstream lat long extent of the location. And so I have downstream and downstream, upstream, points. I just haven't actually turned them into like a line or a polygon, if that's appropriate. Those types of data I still need from restoration practitioners or the projects, that kind of GIS data. I don't have all of that, but I do have upstream, downstream, and it definitely needs some QA/QC. So, once we get lines produced, then to run it back by everybody and make sure that, it's actually depicting the correct area.
No, yeah, I think that's key, because a lot of the projects are reaches, it's not just one spot. It's like, like the photo here, wood structures are placed at specific sites, but in a reach. And I think it's just helpful to know that start and end point.
Yeah, agreed.
For interpreting the monitoring data. And then also, does it have, and I'm just trying to refamiliarize myself, because Javen and I were talking about it earlier today. And so does it has the year implemented, right? Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, in most cases. And if it doesn't, we can find that. But the year is, it's not been they've not been included in the restoration inventory until it's complete. So that's the year that's included, is the completion year, not the implementation year, but that shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah.
Okay. Add that into. So
yeah, because it kind of goes back even to just Stefan's analysis where just that time frame or the timeline of restoration that occurred, upstream of a site or nearby a site, or even within a site, like where the temperature logger is. So it's just something I was thinking about.
Yeah, definitely. Good questions.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for the question, Ken. Does anybody else have questions? We've got about 5 more minutes if anyone has one. Okay, well, thanks, Casey. That was great.
Thank you.
Yeah. So next up, Gus Wathen and Nick Weaver will discuss how monitoring in the John Day relates to the results chain model. They're going to review how to efficiently track progress on restoration objectives and improved ecological health in the basin. So Gus or Nick, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, that'd be great.
Okay, I'm gonna start off here.
Great.
Screen 1. We working? We firing?
Not yet.
Not yet?
Nope.
Oh, how about now?
Yeah, that looks promising. There it is. Beautiful.
Bingo. Okay, yes, I'm Gus Wathen. Today I'm gonna talk to you about what we've been up to as kind of acting as this monitoring coordinator. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors and have really a special acknowledgement to Hannah. She's probably having a rough day right now because she's the only one on this presentation without a last name that starts with W. So, let's see here. Let's go ahead. Oh, here we go. So today I'm going to start out by just reviewing the results chain model and the strategies associated with that. And then kind of talk about how a bunch of the projects around the FIP are doing monitoring and relating to the results chain. From those conversations, we've identified some needs in the monitoring landscape. And I'm going to talk about some solutions for those needs, and then kind of outline a roadmap for monitoring going forward. So here is the results chain model. Sorry, the words are so small, you can't really read it, but everybody's got it memorized anyway, I'm sure. The results chain model articulates the partnership's theory of change by displaying the relationships between restoration strategies and implementation results, and then short and long-term ecological results. So yellow are the restoration strategies that fall into 8 different categories: protecting land and water, reconnecting floodplains, riparian restoration, channel restoration, structural additions, fish passes restoration, improving water quality and quantity, and upland restoration. And then there's the kind of short-term implementation results: how many pools we dug, how many plants do we plant. But then some of the harder questions to answer are the ecological results resulting from that restoration. And the way that we can keep tabs on those is through monitoring. Every project related to the FIP has some form of monitoring associated with it. There is tier 1 monitoring, which is basic implementation monitoring and accounting. This is something that is typically done with the budget that OED supplies for that monitoring. Then you kind of can start delving into the mechanisms with tier 2 and tier 3 effectiveness monitoring. These might require an additional funding to achieve these things. These tiers are kind of loose categories that we've tried to place each monitoring approach into to kind of categorize really its intensity and its its investigation into mechanisms. So at one end of the spectrum, the other end, you might have tier 3. That's what all you guys have been talking about, what's going on in the Middle Fork IMW, or what, the more intensive habitat surveys that Mitch might be doing out on Granite Creek. And then kind of in the middle is what we, it's basically effectiveness light monitoring, trying to get at some of these ecological outcomes with low investment of effort or resources. And so one example of that might be this monitoring that's going to be happening on 30 Mile Creek this summer, the LTPBR floodplain monitoring. So this table here is all the projects funded by the FIP and Biennium 1 and Biennium 2. And then in the columns are the strategies outlined from the results chain model. And my apologies if I missed a box on your project, but this really is just to illustrate at a point that most projects are focused on these restoration actions that are reconnecting floodplains, improving riparian conditions, restoring channels, or adding structure to stream. So given the fact that so many projects are focused on those aspects, it seems like that there's a need out there to establish a common thread between these projects. Some are very different in the type of restorations done, the system that work is being done on, and the type of work that is being used for implementation. But in order to help us take lessons learned from Vinegar to Vincent or Levi's high density wood treatments and kind of export them to maybe other projects with a small degree of monitoring, it would be super helpful across the basin to have some common thread to be able to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. So if we're dreaming about this common thread and finding a solution, there's some sideboards that we have to work with. Really, everybody's got monitoring around their own project, things that they're focused on and things that they want really to delve into. But across these projects, it would be really helpful to have some form of standardized data collection and metrics kind of generated from this data collection so that we can be talking about the same thing across projects. Now, it also needs to be economically feasible. I think the restoration projects funded through the FIP, they get $3,500 for monitoring. And so how can we stretch that money to provide the most information with the least amount of economical expenditure? Whatever we do has to be approachable for a lot of people. We have these geniuses talking about what's going on in the Middle Fork, but what about for everyday Joes like me? What's something that we can hand to people at a wide range of ability sets to give them something to go out and collect something that's meaningful. Everybody's super busy, and so nobody has a bunch of time to add to their monitoring that they're doing across their project. So something needs to be low effort, but have high yield. And we cannot remake the wheel for every little thing. So how can we operate within the existing infrastructure that we may have at our fingertips? And thirdly, we need to take the onus off precision, not worry so much about getting something exactly right or repeatable. If we're monitoring on these restoration projects, we want to be able to document gigantic changes to the riverscape. So changes that hit you in the face. We're not trying to pick up a 1 millimeter change in mean particle size. It's more like how many acres of floodplain did we activate? So we've identified two tools to kind of help fill out those that wish list for a solution. The first one being a rapid geomorphic survey. This already exists as part of the low-tech process-based restoration monitoring protocol that OWEB funded a couple years ago. We've gone ahead and just, it's a planning and monitoring data application that is, that we have then gone and just kind of taken the monitoring right out and put it in a separate box to simplify things. But this is essentially an on-the-ground rapid geomorphic assessment of what you are seeing out in your stream channel as you walk through it. A second component is using the desktop rapid or desktop assessment and aerial imagery analyses. So really providing a work plan, a standardized GIS workflow to generate meaningful riverscape assessment metrics from consumer level drone imagery or whatever you can get your hands on. If it's just Google Earth, how can we maximize the data that is sitting there? How can we make that useful for us on our project? So I should say with this aerial imagery analysis, my friend and colleague, Nick Weber, is going to talk to you a little bit more about this. I'm going to kind of go through how all the steps going from data collection all the way to synthesis of how rapid geomorphic assessment might be conceptualized and go through, you know, just all those steps of how you're going to utilize and take care of and store that data. So for a rapid geomorphic assessment, really all you need is an iPad and a depth rod. This application is in a FileMaker database, and so that is that works really well on Apple devices. So iPads are kind of mandatory for this, but this application is also a database, and so it is storing your data as you collect it. We have talked with the monitoring subcommittee about providing a one-day workshop, maybe around Kimberly, sometime in July. We're going to finalize a date for that, and Hannah will transmit that. But if that gives you a little bit of courage to get out there and do that, and having a support network to show you what buttons to press, I think that is well worth the time. Also with data collection, like, don't be afraid to use the help button. If you don't have someone that's rearing to take up a new application and a new protocol and go out and do this, you know, someone else from the partnership could go and do it for you, or you could hire someone. These surveys we've done them on stage 0 restoration, where there's 5 channels going on at once, and you know, you can still cover multiple miles in a day. And simplified systems, you can really cover a lot of ground in a day. So there's a lot of bang for your buck. For data storage, as I mentioned, this is the FileMaker is a database. So you can save that on your desktop. You can also export CSV files of raw data that you can then bring into your own Access database to help monitor your project and kind of track progression. We can also talk about within the partnership, if we have enough interest in this, have facilitating cloud storage for raw data. And then, you know, as far as data analysis, what happens with these data you collect in this in the field is that this application already has metrics generation built into it. So you can, just like you export CSV files for raw data, you can also export your metrics so your data analysis is pretty much done for you with a click of the button. You can go decide to get this app one day, go and walk your 4 miles of stream, and then have your data analysis done that evening over a cold beer. So what I'm talking about really, talks is focused on those strategies 2, 3, 4, and 5. And it really ticks quite a few boxes of things that we're trying to keep our eye on with the results chain model. As we go to summarization and reporting, what are we going to do with these data? Again, here we have the opportunity to work with something that we've already got. We have the John Day Basin Partnership Project Tracker. And so Kristen is going to facilitate 4-year projects, having cells available to insert your metrics from your rapid geomorphic surveys onto here. So these data can be tracked through the project tracker. And finally, what are we going to do with all this stuff? Well, these data will be able to allow us to answer across the basin. Are we reconnecting floodplains? Are we enhancing riparian vegetation extent? Are we increasing complexity and diversity of habitat? Are we increasing fish habitat quality and quantity? It'll also allow us to do kind of cost benefit analysis across projects. How much floodplain connection are we getting from this restoration approach versus this other one over here, and help us kind of track progressions, set trajectories going forward, and also really help with adaptive management in a rapid way. Are we on a pathway towards recovery, or do we need to make changes? And can we do that quickly? Can that be informed quickly? So yeah, but I think before that we start taking questions, I'm going to pass the mic over to Nick to talk to you a little bit more about the GIS component of this. So I'm going to stop presenting. All right. Maybe. There we go.
Hey, Gus, that was great, thanks. So I'm going to try to share my screen. And how are we doing? You guys have a presentation?
Looks good.
Okay, thanks. Okay, great. So I'm Nick Weber with Ecological Research. I've worked with a lot of you for quite some time, but I'm a little bit new to the John Day Basin Partnership Coordination conversations, but I'm going to just quickly continue what Gus was talking about. Talk a little bit about a conversation we had in a call last week that really is going to revolve around kind of leveraging aerial imagery and how that applies to, and applying it to effectiveness monitoring. So where are we again? So, Gus mentioned these tiers of monitoring, and he also mentioned this low-tech monitoring protocol. Again, an OWEB initiative, a lot of this protocol designed in the John Day, kind of fits the tier 2 really well, low barrier to entry, cheap, accessible, so ideally a useful tool for all of us. And, it's a great tool again, and just because, and Gus mentioned this, that, it already does link a lot of these kind of metrics that fall into the results chain objectives. It is really developed with an eye toward, are we making progress toward these things like floodplain connectivity, fish habitat capacity, kind of more of these contemporary restoration objectives, like, pushing our systems toward things like, these these channel evolution stages. And Gus also mentioned the protocol really has these two components, right? The field survey protocol, pretty turnkey data capture solution, metric generation, in-channel geomorphic units, structural survey. So really complements a lot of the restoration you all are doing in terms of increasing complexity, structural treatments, et cetera. I'm going to talk a bit more about the remote riverscape survey, which is a little less developed and is really that desktop GIS analysis of imagery. And I think really an appropriate conversation to be having now as part of some of the other initiatives the partnership is working on. So what does this look like? It's really kind of user-driven digitization of riverscape features. So, it's clicking on a GIS, some of these things we talk about, how much floodplain connectivity do we have? How much riparian vegetation do we have? How is our channel area, channel organization changing? The idea is that we'd be able to use lots of different imagery sources, right? Could be acquisitions from consumer or pro drones. I know, and we're going to hear from Herb later about the drone squadron that's part of the John Day partnership. So I know that you guys are generating a huge amount of this information. So this seems really important. And we can't just limit it to our own acquisitions. Could be things like referencing historic Landsat imagery, Google Earth, et cetera. And yeah, I already mentioned this, but quantifying riverscape features, floodplain extents, riparian vegetation, things like that. Kind of the problem with the way it was implemented within the low-tech monitoring protocol is that the doing really wasn't well defined, right? We left it pretty open. Your GIS platform of choice, or even Google Earth digitizing features. The data capture itself within the protocol as it existed was pretty basically storing actual areas of these riverscape features, storing the actual GIS files. So really basic calculation of and quantification of riverscape features and metrics, but the doing of it wasn't well defined. And so we had a conversation amongst the monitoring team last week. How can we continue to push this component of the protocol forward, really leverage all the imagery you guys are gathering, and have another rapid approach to monitor the effectiveness of your projects. So some of the priorities moving forward that are going to need to be discussed, how do we actually refine these survey protocols? We want to extend the protocols as they exist to include geomorphic units and structural elements. So similar to what's now being implemented in the field, we want to be able to do in a desktop GIS as well. Come up with better ways for enforcing GIS consistency and data standards, so we end up with standardization of what data is gathered so that's easily consumed in other locations, referencing where imagery sources were coming from, and absolutely increasing the amount of documentation and training for the actual implementation of these GIS protocols. So just an example of some of the things that my group is currently doing. So we, and this is just an example, I'm not saying this is how we need to implement as part of this initiative, but we've been leveraging QGIS and their plugin environment to easily deploy these GIS standards. So this is an example of what we've done to develop a consistent way for capturing low-tech restoration designs on a GIS. You can see consistent symbology, consistent naming of features, etc. Another example is you can enforce things like custom data entry fields when new features are created. Again, this is an example of just a low-tech design creation. And also we can automate and automatically generate a lot of summaries for these surveys so that they're easily exportable, easily consumable, can be incorporated into reporting, permitting, funding, acquisition, etc. So there's a lot of things to consider. This is just an idea going forward, but I think a direction that would be really useful to the partnership. Some of the biggest questions I have, assuming, and Gus alluded to this as well, let's assume we can enforce these GIS standards, come up with consistent data and metrics. What does long-term consumption, storage, dissemination of this information look like? I know the partnership has the John Day Basin Tracker. I know you have an ArcGIS online infrastructure. We definitely want to recognize those things and explore the possibility that this is the solution for some of these goals. We also really want to absolutely be able to facilitate things like repeating these surveys over time, sometimes at long time scales, and facilitate easily reporting of project outcomes. So that was kind of high level, but that is, that's kind of a conversation that we're having as a group going forward. So I'd love to hear from the group questions and comments for both me and Gus's content. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Gus and Nick. That was really great. Any thoughts how you might interact with these potential solutions, or any questions on it? Kristen commented that there's some inexpensive options for iPads online if you're interested. So thanks, Kristen. Ken has his hand raised. Go ahead.
What a surprise. Ken has his hand up. I feel like I'm the only one talking and asking questions, so apologize for always hogging the Q&A, but and thank you, Gus, for walking us through for the rapid geomorphic survey. So what it looks like, from the steps, data collection, storage, analysis, and reporting. So I really appreciate you doing that. I know it's something that we had sort of asked for in the past. And as you start to, describe that, it helps me better understand what that might look like. And so one of the questions that I had was, I like how the app generates the metrics, after you collect the data. And I guess so that's just whenever you did it, right? And so for the analysis that I'm wondering, I like change detection. So how do you see that working for evaluating the effects of a restoration project? Would you say have two surveys, one before and one after at some interval, and then you would look at the difference in those metrics that the app generates?
Yeah, precisely. I mean, if you have a project, maybe it's 1 mile, maybe it's 4 miles. Ideally, that you have the ability to have enough monitoring visits where even if it only takes 1 day by one person, that's a much smaller ask than it is to get a trained habitat monitoring crew to go out there. So if you can go and do that, then you could collect baseline data. You could collect, do a survey directly post implementation. You could do another survey 2 years after implementation to start building those data sets and those points on your graph to show your trajectory towards recovery. I think that would be the ideal. I mean, 2 points is it's tough to say something after 2 points, but the more points you have, the better. So I think that what we're trying to suggest here is these ways that you can collect data and have, build up a data set that is informs your project. So you can report, you can use it for adaptive management, and you can set expectations, especially as for you guys at OWEB are seeing more and more phased implementation, and the language becomes a little bit fuzzy as when are the phases coming? When do we do phase 2, phase 3? These can provide those kind of data points to inform that okay, it's time for phase 2. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question. And thank you for always asking questions for everybody. That shows a good attention span.
Yeah.
Can I speak to that really quickly too, Ken? I think that again underlines the importance of the GIS based approaches to these things. you guys are already getting on and implementing a lot of projects. To get any kind of baseline, you can pull in some old Landsat, old Google Earth. Maybe you did do imagery, but you didn't do an on-the-ground survey. So, again, we want a lot of those metrics and those indicators to be, whether it's field-based or, remote-based, be able to roll back and get pre-monitoring information to judge effectively.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I think, that's what I had a similar question for you, Nick. Well, I guess going back real quick to Gus. So is that what you're laying out as monitoring coordinator? Are you sort of laying out like for the partners, like, hey, you got to kind of get out and do your rapid geomorphic survey before the project so we can compare it. We have a second point post project. Are you guys starting to sort of map that out, especially across the phases, so that just that tier 2 data is being collected and sort of who's going to collect it?
Yeah, that's my hope, is that with this presentation, we're dangling some worms out there that people are gonna want to bite on and say, oh, I can go do this, and I can go do it tomorrow if I want. My stream project, my restoration is going to start in July, so let me get out there this June and go and do it. There are, to go and use this application already, there's a protocol. There are hours of YouTube video that Nick has put together on how to use it. So the resources are there. I think additionally, I kind of had this nebulous idea of having a training, but for people that are thinking about it, but maybe a little bit timid and want to get out kind of in a supervised setting, would like to be able to do that early this summer so people can go and do it. But at the same time, not having to hang our heads and say, oh, we missed the boat, because after a lot of these Biennium 1 funded restoration projects are already completed. Well, what can we get from Google Earth imagery or historic drone footage that are aerial imagery that got flown? How can we fill in the voids through that and kind of complement this? Because a lot of the on the ground survey, if you have like a stream that we're looking at here, it looks like Butte Creek. A lot of it could actually be done with aerial imagery. So, it all depends upon setting, but just trying to find a way where we can, with little expense or time to anyone, can maximize the available information at our fingertips.
Yeah. No, that's great, Gus. And I want to be mindful of folks' time, but yeah, I want to follow with you and Nick. I think you're on the right approach. Really interesting, and sort of just laying out that as folks get some examples, of like, hey, we have pre and post, and we did a comparison, and this is how it was done, and this is what we're seeing, just to model that or demonstrate what that might look like.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken, for the questions. We do have another question from Denise in the chat, but we have to move on. But I will say, in our breakout rooms later, if you want to explore that more, and also maybe potential ways of overcoming those barriers, if Gus and Nick have thoughts on those later, we could come back to them with the results of our breakout rooms and see what they think. But now we do have to move on to the bull trout update. Stefan is back for another round. Thank you, Stefan. Oh, sorry, Herb. We're gonna hold on tight for that next update. First, we'll have the UAV monitoring update from Herb.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Looks great.
Excellent. All right, well, yeah, thanks for the opportunity to give an update on our project. This is where we're, I'll give a quick grant overview, kind of give an update on the John Day Basin Squadron that Nick just talked a little bit about. Give everyone an update on the projects that we've flown for the FIP. And then Chris Hyder, who's on, is going to jump in, kind of looking at the results chain. and the different types of data that we can collect with the UAVs or drones or UASs, looking at kind of tier 1, did you do it, tier 3, looking at multispectral stuff. So we'll get started. So really this project is to figure out a way how to use drone data and connect it to the results chain model, similar to the things that Gus was talking about. Some of our objectives, we want to increase capacity basin-wide with pilots and equipment. I'll talk about that a little bit. Chris is going to talk about the unified approach to a tiered UAV monitoring system, which we will be working with Nick and Gus on that too. I'll give a list of all the projects that have been, we've gotten baseline data and some posts. Chris will talk about evaluating some changes and then kind of next steps moving forward with the monitoring committee. So we have our John Day Basin Squadron. These are the folks that have participated so far. Anybody else wants to jump on the train, just give me a holler. But some folks are basically just trying to build capacity throughout the basin with know-how and equipment available. This kind of started with a 319 DEQ grant where we developed a monitoring protocol, and then another grant was done to get basically equipment into the basin. Let's talk about increasing capacity some. So down the lower John Day, we've got 3 pilots, North Fork, Middle Fork area, 3 pilots. These are that I'm aware of in the partnership, then Upper to South Fork, 2 pilots. I'm aware of 6 folks that have been participating with our group that are interested in getting their license. Just real quick on what pretty much the squadron's using across the board. It's just out of the box drones. So there's a Mavic 2 Pro, need a tablet, and then lots of extra batteries, cables, lens filters are helpful, all sorts of things, radios. We have 2 backpacks that we pack around every time we go out. Some trainings. This is we've had a handful of them, but this was probably the one of the most useful ones we had. It was in April of 21, able to get everybody out and about in an open space, and had a handful of drones there, and everybody got to put their fingers on the sticks and fly around, and you could actually see people realize that it's not as scary as it sounds. Kind of moving forward, 2022, we've had a lot of interest in folks wanting to learn more about flight planning with software, which works out pretty good for us. The partnership now has 6 licenses for the drone deploy application. It's pretty powerful software and fairly easy to use. And then I think what's exciting about this platform is we'll be able to share our flight data with partners or funders. And it's really can create ortho images, point clouds, and things like that. So I haven't even really dove into kind of these new features that we get with the software, but we're excited. And then just real quick on, kind of managing the data through this drone deploy platform, which is cloud-based. So we have kind of a results chain-esque kind of diagram here with just basically 3 folders inside this program that basically for each FIP kind of sub-basin group, for the lower John Day, Upper South Fork, North and Middle Fork. And then inside that, we'll have, certified pilots that can go fly projects for people. So we've just kind of put this together where there's a folder inside the sub-basin folder for each partner. And, depending on which pilot is flying for another partner or the partner's flying for themselves, they can just keep all of their implementation projects data in their folder on drone deploy. So that should be pretty handy. And like I said, being able to share that with partners, I think is really going to go a long ways. Real quick on Our project's been quite busy over the last 2 years. Huge amount of data flown by Chris and others, but this is kind of our FIP project list. And we have more to come for 2022. We've already flown for 2022 at Wilson Project and Upper 30 Mile Project. I just want to share a quick basin map kind of outlining all the yellow dots are FIP projects. And then I just wanted to kind of highlight that the capacity for partners to fly non-FIP projects is increasing. And I know this map's kind of busy, but it's kind of the point. There's a lot of flights going on. And now that we have that drone deploy platform, I think being able to manage that data is going to be a lot easier, at least for the implementers with those licenses. And with that, I will turn it over to Chris to talk about the results chain and the work that he's been up to for the project.
Okay, Herb, you're going to keep driving though, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I'm Chris Hyder, Watershed Professionals Network. I think I've met many of you at some point or the other. This is a direct, everybody has to put a copy of the results chain into something whenever we're doing it. This is actually this is a photograph of the tattoo that Herb has on his back of the results chain itself. But this goes back to a lot of the things I just heard in the last talk of Gus and Nick, the metrics themselves. And, the overall objective of this is to figure out how can we use UAVs to save time. It's like back in the 1970s. Can we use computers to save time? And then really, yes, we can, but at the same time, we need to know what we're doing and how and what kinds of things we can extract from it. So, I'm just highlighting a few things here with, coming back to effectiveness metrics. If we're going to spend $1 million on something, is it working? Or if we're going to spend $1,000 on something, is it working? And what do we need to know? So overall, we're looking at a couple of different kinds of platforms. This is a sort of a hodgepodge of R&D with, digging down deep on a couple of projects and then just trying to cover as much breadth as we can. Go ahead there, Herb. In general, we've talked about these tiers, right? And this is something to consider where as we go up, we're kind of coming from an inventory or a count of what we have to what within that inventory do we have in terms compositionally, whether that's vegetation or structural components or some other sort of element, typically composition and structure. And then with tier 3, it's like, well, the other part of that triangle is the function. How is it working? And sometimes we need to dig down and get a little bit tighter detail to find out exactly how things are functioning, particularly if the restoration activity is not as low tech as maybe building a fence, keeping the cows out. We're trying new things, or we're actually doing earth movement or things like that. So as you go and as you increase in these tiers, it's really all about, the analysis you want to do. Because a UAV is going to take some images. You're probably going to just be using a few products that the UAV gives you, and sort of a matter of which sensor you might use. And in general, the more you collect in the field and store, it doesn't really take a whole lot of extra time to do that. And if somebody wants to dig deeper, they can. So, it has to fit the group and what they really want to know out of a project. If it's fencing and planting, it could be a very simple tiered monitoring whether or not those plants are actually living or not, and whether or not it moves through, or whether that fence is holding up or not. And then as we move on into the different metrics, and you can see these are just some examples from the results chain. As you move to the right, there are more things that we can sort of generate from those products, down to the geomorphic surfaces, cross sections, chlorophyll, whether or not the species are actually responding to rewatering through the floodplain or not, those types of things, versus just a simple acres count. Go ahead, Herb. So basically, what we're after is trying to get the right timing of the year. And of course, you throw a pandemia on top of hot temperatures and smoke and fire and whatever else we had in the last couple of years. how do you get out there without walking on eggshells when we can actually, or on light bulb fragments, I guess is what Roger used to say, is, how do we get out there without causing potential more harm or fire damage or anything like that? When you're dealing with aviation and we're dealing with the Forest Service, we do need to seek permissions and things, and they do close it down from time to time. But generally, we're looking at ortho images, DEMs, photo points, and then later on the vegetation indices to see in this picture here, for example, what's going on with that green that we see there. And this is a good example of where we see senescence in the upland vegetation, and we still see chlorophyll pumping as we get closer to the riparian zone. We want to detect that. Go ahead, Herm. And how do you do it? This is a hyperspectral imagery is basically looking beyond what we can see. And I really want to point in between where it says red and near infrared. You see how it's differentiated as you move to the right. You can see these different, you can see shrubs pop up and bunch grasses and rock and all this, and it changes really the way that we can detect things. So once you get to this point, it's like, well, I can see how effective rewatering might be if I capture the right time of senescence, for example, when grasses are dying and up comes the sedges are still going, or the willows or something. Go ahead. There's a cost for it. There it is. I think some of you have seen this before. This is maybe a year or something old, but basically, if you want to have a pocket drone off the shelf and get in there and really outfit yourself around $10,000 or so, including the software package and things that you might need, computer and whatnot. You can do that, and I think many of you have. When it comes to the larger drones and multispectral sensors and such, you're putting a lot more money into it. So you really need to be keeping that thing in the air as long as you can. And really the lifespan of these things is a handful of years, 3, 5, maybe even 7 if you're lucky, type of thing. So that really plays into account. So let's look at some results. This is Vincent vinegar. This is beforehand. This is a DEM. And what we have here in the graph is basically from the roadbed to the toe slope, which on my screen, I can't really see the bottom part of it, but I just made a random line and said, give it to me here and see what we have. And you can see this is beforehand. Go ahead to the next. These are some of the results that we can do that might be tier 2 kind of things. And there's been a whole heck of a lot of work being done out here. Look at that nice web of side channels and things that have been developed in there. And that one thing where it says a tree, the reason why that says it is because the line, you see how that line is a little drifty? It's because I haven't rectified these images quite yet. So that's another sort of technical aspect that needs to be done as you work with more and more drone imagery, and that's something that's just on the docket. This is the same spot. What you see on the left is beforehand, and why you see a whole bunch of green there is because it was in the early June period of 2020, and that was the time that we could have gone. Whereas we're looking at about September of 2021. So timing really matters, when we get out there in terms of a vegetative response. But that wasn't necessarily the only goal of this. We're looking to see, again, what kinds of information we can glean from this from a tier 1 perspective. And that includes like, well, okay, we put a bunch of wood places. How many pieces of wood do we have per unit of measurement? This is a metric. Are they there? Do they stay there? Have they improved anything beyond what we can possibly measure from a tier 1 inventory perspective? And go ahead beyond this. Now we start looking at more of these upper tiers where we're looking at the infrared perspective. Again, the reason why you see a bunch of red on the left, and red is equal to, good analogy is it's pumping chlorophyll, it's pumping water through, evapotranspirative things are working. And on the right, you see a bunch of green, which is a very much lower value because it's September, early September. But where you can see really is where those riparian bursts are. And really what I wanted to show you with this is this is a really good time of year to go ahead and do the sampling if we can get in there because of smoke or some of these other issues that we might run into. Further, we have temperature comparisons, and there's a lot of different things associated with this. Take a moment here and look at the confluence. You can see that lighter blue coupling in with that darker blue. On the left, we have more flow than we do on the right, but they're relativized so that we see the hottest areas next to the coldest areas. And what we can identify, if you look closely, maybe Herb, if you got your little mouse pointer thing, point around those edges where the yellow boundaries were that we were talking about. There you have basically the influence of the riparian zone directly related to temperature versions and infrared versions of what we can see from, what higher level groundwater might be or where surface water might be. And this is a good way to kind of get a handle on where the riparian zone, is. And truth be told, analysis on this not complete or figured out entirely, but one of the goals is to come up with a relativization method so that it's kind of there and it can be repeatable, going back to these metrics that we were talking about.
Hey, Chris, I think we're going to have to run through this stuff pretty quick. We're kind of
okay, right on. So where we have here is now let's go to look at BDAs. This is over in the Lower John Day, which you see by that transect number 10 on your right is a DEM, on the left is the natural image, and up there you can see where those BDAs pop up. So from a fisheries perspective, are we getting the passage that we need? Obviously, with sampling, but are we seeing those habitats starting to form? These are things that can be monitored out as we go forward. I think we're getting close, right?
Yeah, just 2 more, I think.
Okay, biggest considerations here, folks, is the timing of flight. Can we somehow find the balance of low flow and plant senescence versus when the fire season shuts us out? Secondly is how quickly can we get out there when we get snow melt to try to see where high flow is? These are always the issues anyway. But, there's some other elements having to do with it. We've worked with in these workshops before about how to collect data appropriately, how to store it, and then, how to archive it so that its analysis can be happening differently or with other partners. And then that's next steps. Yeah. So we have the last bit of the last salvo, basically, of data collection due in the pre-post changes. And then what I think it's really going to come down to is working with the monitoring committee to figure out how to put monitoring plans together, what those metrics are, and how that project can be sort of maintained adaptively through time, and hopefully UAVs help rather than hinder the process. So it's pretty much it. Right, Herb?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks, Chris. I think, excited to work with Chris and Nick and Gus to, look at some of these newer tools and see how, if we can get some squadron folks, trained up on using that and try it out. But yeah, I think that's all we got. Thank you, everyone.
And we'll also be available this summer if you guys want to hit us up too for another training. Certainly that's on kind of the radar if we want to do that again, with a little more detail.
Great, thank you so much. That was really informative. We have a couple minutes for questions. If anybody has some they want to ask, go for it. Ken, I was waiting for that. Okay.
Oh, this has been fun. It's like a lot of great presentations, you guys, and Herb and Chris, and thank you so much for walking us through that. And it's really cool to see the before and after like that along the transect at V2V. And so I guess I think similar to my comment or request is for Gus and Nick is like you guys show it visually, like, hey, look, it's different. But how do you quantify that and say like, hey, this project, we had before and after, this is the change that we've quantified or the improvement based on these restoration actions. And Are you guys working on sort of those processes so that, or is it like, Chris, you have, because it's challenging, you're the one who has to do that? I'm just figuring how do we get there? How do we quantify the change?
Yeah, that's really the golden question, you know. I mean, so what I'm doing is I'm messing around with different kinds of math, you know, to figure out how we can do this from a quantitative point of view and at what scale. You know, I don't want to be at the pixel scale because who cares about 5 centimeters? You know, I'd rather be, you know, at some like little bit of a scale at some point, community scale or something like that. And really, that's what this summer is going to be all about, because we're going to get the post. Not only do we get the 1-year post in some of these cases where we're actually at post-activity recovery, but vegetation takes a couple of years to respond. So I'm hoping that this year and some of these projects will really start to see the effectiveness, you know, full on, and see like, well, are these BDAs actually putting some additional sedges on the ground, or with VDB or oxbows for that matter. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in there. So yeah, I'm intending on a protocol by which you can do some GIS work and look at it. And we had a good conversation with Nick the other day about possibly how to do this. So I think we need to tie it together, Ken. You know.
Yeah, that was my other,
together, as they say.
That was my other question, was how do what you guys are doing connect to what Nick described?
I think it directly connects. It directly does. It's the filling in of the middle. Like how do we really do that? And I think having the monitoring committee on board, or at least, you know, firing that up and taking some hard looks and deciding what's important and what's not important through these tiers, because we don't want to have analysis paralysis, as they used to call it, right? And you know, we want to have something that can be relatively smooth based on the capacity of the organization that's doing the work. And if you have to contract out or whatever for multivariate, what scope do you want to give them? What kind of information do you want to scope out so that they can actually provide that for you, versus what you may have to do yourself? I think that's really what needs to be figured out. And we may not get it right, but we might be close, at least this year, you know, moving in that direction.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I wanted to talk to that too. I think some of the workflows, you know, we're suggesting could be looked at as kind of subjective. So it's going to be, I think, really awesome and important to be able to back up some of that with, you know, the more detailed kind of mechanistic classification type information that Herb and Chris are generating. So I think it's a really great opportunity.
All right, well, thank you. We are going to move on now to the bull trout presentation I hinted at earlier. So Stefan, if you just want to go ahead and share your screen. And this is our last presentation of the day before we get into breakout rooms. So yeah, thank you.
Cool, thanks, Tori. Can you see my screen okay?
Looks great.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. I'm back with a quick bull trout status and trend monitoring update. So a little bit of background info. The John Day Basin has 3 out of the 24 core recovery areas in the Mid-Columbia recovery units. Those are the North Fork, the Middle Fork, and the Upper John Day, the Upper Main Stem John Day. Bull trout are you know, impacted by a whole bunch of threats, some of which I've listed here, and they're recognized as a species of concern. They're important tribally, and they're ESA listed as well, and so they're often used as justification for restoration projects and management actions and things like that. But despite all that, there isn't really a whole lot of monitoring that occurs specific to bull trout, other than what happens tangentially with anadromous sunmonitor monitoring. And that's kind of that's a big data gap that kind of precludes effective management or prioritization or species status assessments. And so it's kind of filling those gaps, kind of a first step towards moving towards more effective bull trout management and conservation. And so there's a John Day bull trout working group that kind of put together a monitoring plan. This was a few years ago, 2019. That's when I first became aware of it. And around that same time, the OWEB FIP funding was just kind of coming online for the North Fork and Middle Fork John Day. And so we put together a plan to kind of get some resources to implement these monitoring activities that we wanted to do. And it's kind of a three-pronged approach that is trying to get at distribution, status, and abundance. And there's kind of a monitoring action that goes along with each of those, and in some cases overlaps. So we have an eDNA sampling effort. 150 samples is what we had planned for that originally. Occupancy sampling, which is means to say that contributes to some ongoing occupancy modeling work that's being done by ODFMW, their native fish research program. And what that looks like in the field is essentially electrofishing. Spawning and snorkeling surveys, kind of getting at your population status and trend, also trying to establish some index reaches where we can kind of monitor through time, using spawning abundance as a proxy for population health or status. And then with the idea that we would implement this initial effort in kind of an extensive way, but then kind of narrow down our scope of work for future years in a way that could be repeated with perhaps less resources, but still provide some idea of status and trend throughout the basin. And so just to bring us up to speed from when this was first concepted until now, we were awarded FIP funding to kind of move forward with this. It was postponed from 2020. We were supposed to implement in full in 2020. Postponed, we partially implemented last year. We got all of our originally intended eDNA sampling done last year through the efforts of one very dedicated technician. And so we have occupancy sampling and spawning surveys planned for 2022 and potentially some snorkeling as well. And then ODFW was able to secure some supplemental funding to look at genetic diversity and population structure, and in particular hybridization in the North Fork, where there are brook trout present and the potential for hybridization exists. So to kind of give you the updated results for our eDNA sampling, this is all of the locations that we had originally intended. This sampling design is based off of the occupancy model that ODFW put together. And so all of our sampling locations, it's a random sample split between, or kind of allocated to the highest probability areas of bull trout occupancy. And so this is a sampling design that kind of looks for potential expansion from some of those documented and known core populations within these watersheds, and is kind of exploratory in nature. So when we went out and sampled these locations, we found that 50 of them were dry to the point of us not being able to take an eDNA sample, which kind of also precludes the existence of bull trout there. So we counted that as a non-detection. So for the samples that we did collect and analyzed for bull trout, these are the locations in which we got positive detections. And so what that looks like in full is a whole lot of red dots. We did not find bull trout in a lot of places where we didn't already know that they were. And so just because this is the Middle Fork IMW call, I just want to point out that the delineation between the North Fork and Middle Fork is kind of right on the south side of where these green positive detections are. All of these detections occurred in the Desolation Creek system, and all of our Middle Fork samples came up negative. So moving forward, the Middle Fork is a priority area for continued monitoring. Out of the three core population units that we have in the John Day, the Middle Fork, just based on the limited data that we do have and professional opinion, is probably the one that is most at risk for bull trout extirpation over the next 50 to 100 years. And so we want to focus some more attention there to figure out what's going on, and also to try to come up with some management and conservation and restoration actions that might benefit these populations. So we're going to reallocate our unused eDNA samples to kind of, instead of looking for an expanding population, to see if maybe it's a contracting population. We want to recheck some of these areas that have had historical documented presence of bull trout, but maybe haven't been looked at for a long time, and just see where they are currently. And we are going to do a pretty focused effort for the occupancy sampling this summer, Middle Fork included, but also in the North Fork. And then another goal for this year is to get our Middle Fork index reaches, spawning index reaches lined out, so that we can try to use that as a tool for monitoring into the future. So we've partially implemented, we have some data back, and there's I think a lot more to come. So that is the quick update. I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
All right, thank you so much, Stefan. Any questions? Ken, I see your hand.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. Hey, so the way I kind of trying to wrap my head around this and ask an intelligent question. So in the Middle Fork sites, there's historic data that suggests that bull trout are in the Middle Fork in the tribs, but your eDNA results show that you didn't get any detections. Is that right?
That's correct. And I do, just to that point, I just want to highlight that the places where we took eDNA didn't overlap with those places where there were those historical, no, they didn't necessarily overlap. They might have been a small trib to a place that had a historical record of bull trout detection, but mostly it was exploratory or looking for any sort of undiscovered or expanded habitat use.
So it doesn't mean that they're not there, it just means they're not in any kind of these additional spots.
That's correct. Yeah, and so one thing that I didn't include in my presentation, but we did some initial trials for the spawning surveys, and it proved to be fairly difficult. A lot of those systems where we expect bull trout to be in the Middle Fork, like Granite Boulder, Big Creek, they're really hard to survey for spawning surveys. We did have a few reds detected in Clear Creek.
Right.
And I just, tangentially, like we've seen bull trout caught during like juvenile sunmotted surveys. A couple years ago, we saw one down near the confluence with Granite Boulder. So, we're fairly confident they're in there. We just don't know how they're doing, and it seems like they're maybe not doing very well.
Yeah, and that's kind of my other question was, have you seen them as part of other sampling, like even just the work that Matt described, where they were all over the tribs, trying to capture Chinook parr for the genetic sampling. And then what time of year do they spawn?
It's in the fall. It's September, October.
September, October.
Yep.
Cool. And I guess finally, because it's part of the FIP, right? The FIP's funding some of that. Like you said, ODF&W is helping out. Do you see this as, or how do you see this as informing future restoration for maybe targeting bull trout benefits?
I think that, for the Middle Fork, it probably serves to highlight, this is something that's been hammered over and over again for a variety of reasons, but protecting those cold water inputs seems especially important right now, especially if those are kind of those core source populations for bull trout. So anything that we can do to prioritize mitigating for temperature increase or improving connectivity, like those are all like really good outcomes in terms of prioritization for management that could come of this.
And is one last question, is Forest Service on the bull trap working group?
Yes, they are.
Cool, thank you.
Lindsay, I
Wait,
saw.
you're muted. Sorry.
Lindsay, I see your question here about anything about the population size required to detect a signal. It's a great question. It's the exact question that I asked Kelly Karim when she was still working with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and we were putting this together, and she gave me a really good answer that I'm having trouble recalling right now, but it was something, yeah, I remember being actually fairly impressed by what she told me. So it depends on how many individuals are present, and then obviously environmental characteristics of the stream, so flow and flow velocity and things like that. But I remember her telling me that given a certain set of conditions, you could detect a single fish up to 1.5 miles below where it was. But don't quote me on that. She has some literature about that I can try to dig up and share. But that's the extent of what I recall right now.
Cool, thanks. It's good to know there's just literature out there, and something that you guys or we could look into. Thanks.
No problem.
So I think Mark's hand was raised, but no longer is. Maybe his question was answered, or Mark, is there anything you want to add?
I think it was partially answered by Ken's question. I was just curious, some of the major tributaries in the Middle Fork, like Vinegar, Big Boulder, Butte Creek, I assume that EDA samples were taken in them, and you didn't find anything?
Yeah, so Butte Creek was one that we hit pretty hard because there have been some anecdotal reports of bull trout being in there. It seems like a system that might have bull trout, but we did not get any detections in there. And I guess this is probably a good opportunity for me to say that with eDNA, if you get a positive, that's like a really good indicator that a bull trout is there. But if you get a negative, it doesn't exclude the possibility that there's a bull trout in there. So you can't take it as a just as a 1 or a 0. There's a little bit of nuance there, and so for example, Butte Creek would be a great one to go back in with some electrofishing equipment when we're working on the occupancy, informing the occupancy model and seeing if we turn anything up that way. Vinegar Creek has been sampled a lot, not only by us, but by other agencies, and there have not been any detections in it recently, to my knowledge, which is really surprising given the characteristics of that stream. And then tributaries like Big Creek, Granite Boulder, and Clear Creek, we kind of just assume that they're in there. There's enough historical evidence that we didn't go in there and sample, but that's also something like what I was getting at earlier that we might want to go back in there and sample this year just to make sure, because a lot of those systems haven't been targeted for a long time.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Stefan. If anybody has follow-up questions, just note those. And we are about to do something a little more interactive. So we're going to go into breakout rooms, and I've made these Google slides, and each of you will go to the Google slide number. That's the same number as your breakout room, and you'll work on those questions together. So taking notes on those slides, kind of like what we did in the last partnership meeting. And that's just a really good way that Hannah and I can go back through and just have that documentation of what you all want follow-up on, basically. So I'm going to put that in the chat right now. You can go ahead and open those up. If you have any issues, just let me know. And then I'm about to put you in those breakout rooms. So just note before you accept, what number your breakout room is and go to that slide. They're all labeled. And we'll do that for the next 25 minutes. I'll be kind of bouncing around and trying to see where people are at. If it goes really quickly, we might just come back early. But do note that we're going to have report outs afterwards. So make sure you figure out who's going to be speaking for your group and what those highlights are that you want to share. And if you want in particular follow up on any certain item, be sure to make sure you put that in the Google side, like who wants the follow up on which item and which people were in your group. So I hope you stick around for this part. Hopefully it should be a fun discussion. I'm going to go ahead and open those now. Does anybody have any questions before we break out? Okay. I have a few last minute assignments to do. So there you go. Hannah, if you want to just join whichever one you want. Oh no. If there isn't anybody else in your breakout room, just come back to the main room and let me know.
Yeah, I was gonna see who joined what room and then go in.
I think a lot of people just hopped off the call, so we might have to do some rearranging.
Yeah, like Mitch and Javen.
Yeah, okay. Can you open those up, Hannah? Can you see them?
Can I join them?
I can't hear you. Sorry, Ian, hold tight. So we need to move. Javen's with who?
Javen is by herself. Oh, I can move them.
But like, who's her organization again?
Oh, here, wait, I can do it. I now
Okay,
have,
I'll just let you. Yeah.
I now have the power somehow.
Great. And then let's see. We'll put Ian in room 7.
Yeah.
Okay. Five, 4, 5, 4, 5. Okay. That looks good.
Okay, I will go in.
Okay. I can't hear you, but I assume you're good.
You can hear me. That's so weird.
So I think you probably have your ambient noise turned like so that it mutes all sounds unless it's you directly speaking to the mic. I can show you how to change it if you want.
Yeah, because that's so weird.
Okay. So, oh God, well, when I shared my screen, it got rid of my Zoom, of course. So let's see. Shit. That's not gonna work. Okay, well, I'll just tell you, go to in the upper left. Do you know where your preferences are? So for me, I'm on a Mac. What are you on?
It's just a PC. It's a Dell.
Do you know how to get to your Zoom preferences?
I'm like wondering if there's gotta be like a setting or something.
Can't hear you.
I don't know. I can't see like my settings or anything.
I think, oh, maybe it's because you're in Zoom. I don't know. Let's see. Share. So funny that you can't share your Zoom screen.
I know.
Okay, do you see this, the settings?
Oh yeah, okay.
Okay, so however you need to do it, you go to audio and then the suppress background noise.
Okay.
So you can put it on auto. If you put it on low, it'll play like low humming stuff. So you don't necessarily want that. If you do high, it'll get rid of typing. So I just have mine on medium there or auto. But But
I'll
that,
try it once we're off and see if I can get into it. Yeah, I never knew about that.
yeah. Yeah, no problem. Okay. Well, yeah, feel free to join whichever one you want, or if you don't want to, that's okay.
Can you see the Google slides too? I was gonna say, can we see like if they're actually writing in them?
Yeah, here.
Oh,
There you
yeah,
go.
okay.
Okay, so I don't know why everyone hopped off.
I knew that was gonna happen. I was like, this is, everyone's leaving.
I
It was
think
like,
it's because last time they didn't do that. And I think just like the vibe was off this time. Like nobody was asking questions and
hi,
but they're in
Kristen.
there. They're just not writing yet.
Oh, what'd she do?
Huh?
Kristen came on the screen and then she came off. I don't know what happened to her.
Oh, hopefully they can edit. Oops, maybe they can't edit. Oh, yeah, that's why. Okay. Edit. Done. Okay. Oops.
I'll just go join just so they can, just so they know.
Okay. Thanks, Hannah.
Bye.
Bye. Hey, Kristen.